right. Good afternoon. We'll go ahead and get started. My name is Daniel Castro. I'm the director of the Center for Data Innovation, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to today's event, Seizing the Data Innovation Opportunity. The goal of today's event is really to be discussing the future of data-driven innovation in Europe, as well as the many successes that we've already seen to date. Today's event is also marking the official launch of the Center for Data Innovation in Europe. The Center for Data Innovation, for those of you that don't know it, is the leading nonprofit, nonpartisan public policy think tank studying the intersection of data, technology, and public policy. It's a Washington, D.C. based think tank originally that's affiliated with the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation. So I started the Center for Data Innovation a few years ago to help educate policymakers about three main things. First, we wanted them to understand the technologies at the heart of data-driven innovation. It's important that policymakers champion technology, but they can't do this if they don't understand the technology very well. Second, we want policymakers to understand the potential for data-driven innovation to impact social and economic progress. So many of the top priorities that we see for policymakers, whether it's healthcare, or education, public safety, all of them can be addressed, at least in part, through using data, and we want them to understand how they can do this. And third, we want policymakers to better understand the role of how public policy can actually support data-driven innovation. In particular, we want to make sure that there's a forum for policymakers to not only discuss the concerns they have around data and digital transformation, but also have an opportunity to really explore how public policy can be used to maximize the benefits of data-driven innovation. Of course, before we can do all of this, we really have to have a global understanding of the data economy. And Europe has been a particular leader in a number of areas related to data-driven innovation. And we want to make sure that these successes are really captured and shared with policymakers around the world. We also want to make sure that many of the ideas and solutions and practices in other parts of the world are well understood here in Europe so that they can be adapted and used as appropriate. So today, what we're going to discuss with our two distinguished panels is how the existing policy decisions have shaped Europe in terms of data-driven innovation and where Europe needs to go next on this journey. The structure of today's afternoon is going to be as follows. We have a report that we've released today, which my colleague, Paul McDonald, who heads our European office, will summarize briefly. The report is called Europe Should Embrace the Data Revolution. We have copies outside if you haven't already received one. It's also going to be available on our website to download. Following this, we're going to have our first panel discussion. This will focus around the question, how have policymakers contributed to Europe's data successes, followed by a second panel, which will discuss what should this data innovation roadmap look like. Our goal is to have this be a very open discussion, so your comments and questions are going to be very much encouraged. Also, we're going to be joined by Alexander De Croo, Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Development, Cooperation, Digital Agenda, Telecom, and Postal Services of the Government of Belgium at 4 p.m. So we're going to take a brief pause on our second panel to hear his remarks, have a discussion around that, and then finish up the program. We're going to end by about 5 o'clock, at which point we'll have a reception out in the hall, which I hope you'll stick around to join us for this. Just before we begin, a few logistics first, so everyone knows this event is being recorded. The video will be posted on our website following the event. We encourage everything to be discussed. This is on the record. You're welcome to tweet. We're using the hashtag data innovation. And finally, I'm supposed to tell you that in the event of emergency, the exits are right here on the right. Hopefully we won't be experiencing that though today. Again, I really want to thank all of you for being here today. This is a very exciting conversation that we're very happy to be a part of. We hope this will be a long and engaging dialogue over the next few years. And with that, I'd like to invite my colleague, Paul McDonald, to introduce our new report. Thank you, Paul.
Thank you, Daniel. Good afternoon. I'd like to spend just about 15 minutes or less summarizing the findings of Daniel's and my report, Europe Should Embrace the Data Revolution. New technologies have made it easier and cheaper to collect and to analyze information so that we understand the world and ourselves better. And technology, I think, has also helped us to develop tools like algorithms that can assist us in reacting to information where in certain circumstances such a reaction could be a matter of life and death, or when we just want recommendations about what other books or music to explore. So we're in the midst of a brand new industrial revolution, perhaps, or maybe it's just a continuation of the previous industrial revolution. But there can be no doubt that the industrial and the digital revolutions are converging to create a new economic model. And at the core of this model is data. The stakes for Europe could not be higher. Unemployment in the European Union is running at 11%. The population is aging. The workforce will be 14% smaller by 2030. And this is presenting pretty huge fiscal, social, and economic challenges, the only solution to which is for Europe to increase its productivity. Any strategy to increase productivity in the European Union that does not place organizational models and innovations using data at its heart will be simply unviable. Our ability to internalize data innovation as a liberating factor that will increase our productivity as workers, our choices as consumers, and enhance our social and cultural lives as citizens is one of the central economic issues of our time. This report here, which you should have a copy of, is a snapshot that identifies innovation across a number of sectors and points to where public policy, though well-meaning, has created challenges and problems, to areas where public policy has helped and where we think it can help further. So, what do we mean by data innovation? Technologies are emerging that help us to make sense of complexity. Big data means our ability to interrogate large data sets, not just as samples from larger groups, but of entire groups, such as all of the users of a public service or every vehicle in a commercial fleet of trucks. Now, some areas, such as astronomy or weather forecasting, have been using big data for quite a while. But innovations in software and in the use of algorithms, algorithms really are pieces of computer software that recognize and respond to specific configurations of information. And of course, less expensive technology have brought this approach to using massive data sets to all sorts of other sectors, to brand new sectors. So businesses can analyze data about where their customers are, and they can get rapid feedback about product performance and customers' evolving needs and overall market trends. So for example, you probably know Netflix uses big data that's informing its own production of shows, and it's determining what consumer tastes are. And I don't think we should find this too strange. This is really what Shakespeare did, only it was all in his head. But it's a way of responding to the world. So I think in addition to this, the Internet of Things, which describes a set of devices embedded with sensors and actuators on a network, is creating a world of connected objects, from wearable medical devices or home automation systems to intelligent rubbish bins that tell refuse collectors when they need to be emptied. By 2020, there may be as many as 50 billion such connected devices worldwide, and it's been estimated that the Internet of Things alone will contribute up to $11 trillion in value per year globally by 2025. So, how is Europe doing in this new world? Well, let's take a look at a number of sectors, and I want to just focus very briefly on 6 areas. Education. In education, there are initiatives in Belgium, Italy, the Netherlands, Norway, Sweden, and the UK, which, to varying degrees, are looking at platforms to deliver interactive content and to personalize instruction. This will be supported by collecting and analyzing data about how students are completing assignments and coping with the work they've been given. Dashboards are being developed to monitor student progress. Finally, the technology will actually allow educators to create longitudinal data sets of anonymized student records that can be tracked from early childhood education right through to the workplace. So there'll be some sense about what role education is playing on overall life success. So let's take a look at energy. In energy, by 2020, Europe will have 200 million installed smart meters for electricity, covering over 70% of all European consumers, and 45 million meters for gas, representing around 40% of consumers. This will help energy saving and competition in Europe's energy markets. Europe is on the way to developing smart electricity grids, where devices plugged into the wall will communicate with the network to optimize energy consumption depending on the time of day or perhaps depending on the demand on the overall grid. Environmental management is another area that has benefited from Internet of Things technology. The European Commission has led the Copernicus program, which provides Earth observation data from satellites and a network of sensors to monitor the land, the sea, and the air. This can help identify illegal fishing. It can help identify how healthy is the marine ecosystems. And of course, it can support the development of sustainable fishing policies and identify areas affected by flooding as well. This will allow responders to come and help in areas that are flooded. Another system, which is the Mediterranean Decision Support System for marine safety, combines data from many sources to monitor and predict the risk of oil spills in the Mediterranean. And in fact, in Spain also, Getaria in northern Spain, around the town of Getaria, the authorities are using sensors to monitor the air and the water pollution so they can respond very quickly because, of course, it's not just a question of the safety of the people, which is the paramount issue here, but also, of course, the safety of their tourist industry, which depends on a pristine environment. In healthcare, the Innovative Medicines Initiative, which is a public-private partnership with 1.6 billion funding from the EU's Horizon 2020 program, is advancing health research and sharing medical data. One of these is the Medical Information Network, which links patient-level data from health providers with clinical studies to identify markers of susceptibility to dementia and to predict which individuals with obesity will develop complications like diabetes. Individual European countries have also committed to using data to improve healthcare. For example, the UK's National Health Service has established the Care.Data program to expand the use of patient data. This allows researchers and administrators to compare treatment costs and effectiveness, to study disease, and to identify disparities in care, and so to use their budget more effectively, to identify what works in terms of treatment and to devote resources to that. Another initiative, Neuromics, which is funded by the EU, aims to improve diagnosis and treatment for neuromuscular and neurodegenerative diseases through the study of genetic material and the development of data sets that will help, again, help develop better targeted treatment. Smart cities. In smart cities, Europe, in a way, I think, is a leader. We're very much a pioneer in Europe in smart cities. Barcelona, Amsterdam, and London are implementing technologies on public transportation systems in buildings and on their streets. Barcelona, for example, and Milton Keynes have programs to embed sensors into parking spots, allowing drivers to find available spaces. Barcelona has built a water system for its public parks, which adjusts itself according to current rainfall and temperature and time of day and so on. Amsterdam has a system that warns civil engineers about potential damage to its levees. And London is piloting a system developed by the Royal London Society for Blind People called Wayfinder that uses location marking beacons to help people with vision impairment navigate indoor urban environments like a tube station, for example, an underground station. The European Commission's Horizon 2020 Research and Innovation Programme has budgeted 92 million euro in 2014 to support smart cities research, and many European countries are pursuing important smart cities projects right now. And the final area I want to quickly look at is smart manufacturing. The application of the Internet of Things to manufacturing reduces waste, prevents equipment failure, boosts efficiency, and improves quality control. Germany has very much led the way with its Industry 4.0 initiatives, which have helped manufacturers like Volkswagen to transform their own production. To allow its cars to be manufactured to order, customer information at Volkswagen can be transmitted to each section of the automobile production, and correct parts can be assembled at the right stage, according to what the order actually is. So the smart manufacturing, and I think this is very important, has a number of very interesting properties, such as the ability to stop, start, or switch production according to demand, while not losing any of the efficiency associated with mass production. Now, on top of these initiatives, the European Union and member state governments have signed up to the Open Data Initiative. There is consensus now in Europe that open data is something that we should all be pursuing. France, Germany, Italy, and the UK signed the 2013 G8 Open Data Charter, committing to, for example, committing to releasing data by default, ensuring its quality and its quantity. Of the 69 countries participating in the Open Government Partnership, which is an initiative to promote open data, 31 are European. In a 2015 survey evaluating open data policies around the world, the UK, Denmark, Finland, and the Netherlands, Norway, and France all rank in the top 10. And this is not just about governance. The European market for goods and services that rely on open data will be about 75.7 billion euro by 2020, which is a 37% increase from 2016. And European governments themselves are expected to save about 1.7 billion euro through open data by 2020. So we've had in Europe leadership from the European Commission, which has initiated such projects as the Digital Single Market and Europe 2020 to support conditions for not just growth and use of data, but of course economic growth through use in data. The Commission has also created the European Open Science Cloud to allow researchers to store, share, and analyze data across borders and scientific disciplines. In 2014, the European Commission committed to supporting lighthouse data initiatives that improve digital skills and infrastructure, share public data, digitize public services, and create data-friendly laws and regulations while using public procurement to bring data technologies to market. As part of this effort, the Commission has also launched its public-private partnership initiative on big data to bring together European businesses, academics, and policymakers to strengthen all levels of the data value chain to support the data economy. So, what are the remaining challenges? For all of its initiatives, and those at member state level, there is, I think, a sense that European institutions, Europe's governments, its civil society institutions, many of its companies and utilities, and perhaps some of its unions and business organizations need to do more to internalize the need for data innovation as something that is needed for growth and development. So I think we have initiatives, we have leading projects. The Commission has done a great job in pointing the way and setting a framework, but there is a sense that perhaps as Europeans we're not internalizing this, maybe at the member state level, enough. At the same time, I think there is some dissonance. Europe has created political consensus on the need to protect privacy by regulating how personal data is handled, which certainly impacts on how data is used, but it has achieved no similar consensus on what's needed to take advantage of data-driven innovation. At the same time, there is a tendency for policymakers in Europe to openly speculate about hypothetical problems, such as a supposed hogging of data by big companies that could keep smaller companies out of the market, and supposed consumer problems that could arise from platforms, when no such problems have been identified by competition regulators, and where, in any case, the innovation process is too fluid and too early to reliably come to any policy conclusions. We simply don't know yet. Data innovation is at an early stage, And of course, policymakers and regulators should be curious about how this evolution is happening, and they should be curious about where it's going. But they should intervene only when there is an obvious issue, and they should not openly speculate about possible interventions to solve hypothetical problems in the absence of hard evidence from competition regulators that such problems even exist. This aspect of European technology policy is precautionary. It runs counter to the policy goals of developing data innovation in Europe. To some extent, it's feeding off anxieties that come from a lack of familiarity with new innovation. And we have analyzed this anxiety in a number of reports. And I think that it's feeding, it may be unintentionally contributing to a questioning of the whole legitimacy of the idea of data innovation at certain levels. So I think we have to be careful about this. So part of what's holding Europe back are open questions about perhaps the very legitimacy of data-driven innovation. These are questions which the institutions in Brussels cannot address on their own. There exists at a political level in member states, in civil society groups, in traditional economic sectors, and in other representative organizations, a certain amount of, I think, duty, a certain amount of need to think about these things, because data innovation is really about change. And regardless of how compelling a case is made, change does bring anxiety. And so in this case, I think there is anxiety, and I think we have to address anxiety, but I think we have to be careful about making policy based on anxiety. So we have a number of recommendations to help Europe's environment for data innovation, and they're quite specific. We are recommending first, each EU member state should follow the lead of France and appoint a national chief data officer. These chief data officers should be tasked with overseeing the implementation of open data initiatives within their respective governments, and they should take the lead in developing and promoting national strategies to accelerate the transition of the non-government sector to become more data-driven. Second, the European Council should establish an independent advisory panel made up of national chief data officers to work with the European Commission and the Parliament to forge consensus around a cohesive vision and strategy for capturing the full benefits of data-driven innovation in Europe. Third, building on its 500 million big data public-private partnership, the European Commission should accelerate lighthouse projects that demonstrate the value of data-driven innovation in key sectors, including agriculture, manufacturing, finance, transportation, and healthcare. As the European Commission moves forward with refining its digital single market strategy and funding the EU's Horizon 2020 Research and Innovation Initiative, it should continue its support for data-driven innovation through PPPs, not only for research, but for projects that continue to demonstrate the technology and its effectiveness to the public and private sectors. And finally, I would say our view would be that it's incumbent on policymakers, both in Brussels and in member states, and on us here from think tanks, industry and unions and so on, and from the non-profit organizations, to understand the role that data innovation will play in all of our lives, and to look for ways in which it will help us to achieve our goals and to pursue policies that will unlock its potential for Europe. Thank you. Okay. Thank you for listening. This brings us to our panel discussion. Our panelists today are John Higgins, Director General of Digital Europe, Michael Boni, Member of the European Parliament, Liam Benham, who's Vice President for Government Affairs at IBM, and I think we're still waiting on Kaya Kallas, but we will proceed. So, our first panel will attempt to answer the question, how have policymakers contributed to European data success? So this is really a review of what we've been doing in Europe, how Europe has been doing to date. And we want to get an idea, I suppose, about the things that Europe has done right, but also what opportunities have been missed and how effective we think policies have been. So to the first question, Europe has what we call early successes. This is what in our report we say Europe has had early successes in areas like education, energy, environment, management, health, smart cities, and so on, smart cities. Yet there's a strong sense that Europe has not really taken full advantage of the innovation we have and hasn't really built on it. I think, can I come to you, John, and if you can speculate on why this might be, if it's true.
Well, thank you very much, Paul. Let me start by just saying welcome to Brussels. You guys, it's really good to have the Centre for Data Innovation here in town. I've been a big fan of your sister organisation, ITIF, for many years, and it's great to have you here. So, Paul, you introduced me as the Director General of Digital Europe. Digital Europe's the tech industry association here in Brussels, and we have two goals. One is to make Europe a great place for the tech industry to thrive and for multinationals to see it as an attractive place to invest. But we also have a second goal of wanting Europe to be taking full advantage of the opportunities from digital. And I think this discussion fits exactly into that category. I've also, for the last, I realise it's now nearly 2 years, I've been chairing an internal think tank. I'm sure it's not as good as your think tank, but I've been chairing an internal think tank for the Commission, specifically organised by DG Grow, looking at the how we can accelerate the transformation of Europe's industry and enterprises. And of course, in that work also, what should we do about data innovation sort of figures large. Now, I have to say, I'm not very good at looking back. I always feel I'm a little better at looking forward. So I'm going to try and answer your question a bit by looking forward, and I hope I don't sort of cross the line into the second panel too much. But I mean, you painted a very attractive picture of all the great things that small businesses are doing, that public service servants are doing, emptying the bins and so on. And I think it's just worth looking a little bit into the mindset of the people who are faced with these challenges to see where they are now. If you're a small business about to set up a business that's based on data analytics and you've got some new business model, or you're the public servant charged by the mayor of introducing data analytics into your refuse management system, I think you're going to be a little nervous. I think you're going to be excited, but I also think you're going to be a bit anxious for all the reasons that you've said, that sort of European dissonance, or is it all right? Will I be crossing any lines? And there've been quite a few examples of businesses that have actually gone belly up because of that. There was one, it was a couple of years ago now, but you might be aware of In Bloom. It was a not-for-profit that was set up with actually a substantial amount of money from the Gates Foundation to do the sort of thing that you were describing, Paul, in the education field. Take lots of data and use it to predict better outcomes and help with personalised learning programs and so on. So, that was a great idea, but they closed down. And the reason that they closed down, according to their chief executives, because to build public acceptance for the solution will require more time and resources than anyone could have anticipated. They just underestimated how long it would take to take people along with them. Now, we've sort of reached a bit of a settled situation in Brussels on data, you could argue now, in that the General Data Protection Regulation has at least been passed. I know that the member states have now got to implement it, but you could argue we know where we are a bit. And what I've seen happening is that some forward-looking member states are now beginning to put together the sorts of expert groups that you described. So I know, for instance, that the Netherlands and in Finland, they're forming expert groups to say, okay, well, what is this data landscape we're now in, and how can our public servants and SMEs and large businesses, how can they thrive in that landscape? But it's interesting that they are doing it at a member state level. They're not doing it at a European level. They're not combining that sharing, that thinking together. And in fact, I think the meeting I was at with these member states, each of them didn't know that they were doing this. So I think to sort of answer the question, I think that what the opportunity is for Europe right now is to, in a way that you describe as a great example, is to bring this member state expertise together so that we can develop some European guidelines in how to safely, securely, and with confidence take advantage of the data innovation that we need to if we're to see that sort of economic and social progress from data.
Okay, thank you, John. Let me go to Michal next. Michal Boni, you're a member of the European Parliament, you're a member of the Civil Liberties, Justice and Home Affairs Committee, and the Committee on Industry, Research and Energy, and on the Internal Market. And you're also a founding member of the Intergroup on the Digital Agenda for Europe, so you're a good person to be here. What can you tell us about where you think we've got it right and where we haven't got it right? You know.
Firstly, thank you very much for invitation and thank you very much for presentation of this report. I think that it is very important to understand that all our economy and many aspects of our private life and social life is under the digital revolution. And this digital revolution is related to new possibilities, new opportunities to process the data and to use the data and to change all products and also all services. Those products and those services due to processing the data are much more personalized. We are challenging the personalization of education, the personalization of medical services, the personalization of many devices, and Internet of Things also will be the personal way and communication between among all devices and our decisions. So this is a real revolution. If we understand all drivers of this revolution, I think that the energy and hard work on digital single market is focused on overcoming fragmentation, because we need to have the area for one solution, not for 28 regimes. But on the other hand, I think that there are many silos in Europe, also in Brussels here. When I'm talking with my colleagues from agricultural committee, I think that they are full of concerns related to digital, because they are thinking that digital is something like GMO, and it will destroy European farming and European agriculture. When I'm talking with my colleagues from Environment Committee and suggesting that we need to organize together our efforts on mHealth, because health is under the competition of Environment Committee in the European Parliament, but digital is much more oriented to the work of ITRE Committee. So this is not so easy to convince them that this is a common effort and this is a common challenge and a common opportunity. So we need to overcome those kind of fragmentation, not only among member states, but also in our minds and among institutions. Secondly, which is important, we need to understand what does it mean data, especially personal data. Through many years, we have discussed on General Data Protection Regulation. We have finalized the work on this regulation, but from my point of view, this is not the end of the work. This is the beginning. Why? Because we will have 2 years temporary period, and during this period, we need to work together, all stakeholders, for better implementation of this regulation, and, for example, to make much more harmonized those 54 options in General Data Protection Regulation, which can give the solution to member states. If we want to have mHealth, we need harmonized solutions also in the area of sensitive data, sensitive personal data. And the last point is the second was intelligent, smart, reasonable work on data protection regulation implementation. And the last point is related to understanding the data value chain, as you mentioned in your presentation, because I think it is very, it is very important. We need to understand all aspects, collecting of the data, transferring the data and all conditions for transferring the data, processing the data, and also the problem of ownership and the sharing. I think that we will have during the panel some possibilities for the definition how to share the data and what we understand when we are talking on the data ownership, because I think that this is for the future, it is the key.
I'm going to ask you, do you think that, that the GDPR is in danger of fragmenting in terms of implementation at member state level?
In some areas, yes. Okay. In some areas, yes, because when I'm looking at the possibilities for processing health data, there are some possibilities, some opportunities, some options for member states, and if they will decide to have separated solutions on the rules, on the conditions, how to process the personal data in the healthcare area, so it will be impossible to have mHealth all over the Europe.
I want to come to Liam Benham next on this question. Liam, you're Vice President, Government and Regulatory Affairs of IBM Europe. You're an IBM ambassador to the EU and also to Turkey and Russia. And you're Vice Chair of the Business Europe Digital Task Force. How do you rate what we've been doing in Europe for the last, I guess, since 2000, give or take? What have we got right?
Sure, Paul, thank you. I think that's the first time I've been called an ambassador, so thank you very much for that. Maybe more to come in my career, who knows. And can I just welcome this initiative, by the way? I think we really need a balanced debate around data in Europe, and I think this is one of the initiatives that can help to restore some of the much-needed balance. So I really commend the work that you, Paul, and Daniel have done to date on this. First of all, IBM has a big business in Europe, so we clearly see this as an innovative continent. We have a number of references which I could reel off about work we have done with governments on smarter cities. And actually, I've got a sense of déjà vu sitting in this room, because about 3 years ago, our CEO, Ginny Rometty, gave a speech entitled Competitive Advantage in an Era of Innovation, where she talked about data as the new competitive advantage, how a new generation of leaders is trying to build a data-driven future. And then she talked about some of the challenges we face, and one of the challenges back then was, are we going to get the GDPR right and create the right framework for Europe? So I would say at a local level, at a provincial level, we've been doing some excellent work. Companies in this room have been doing excellent work with cities around Europe, making the traffic run more smoothly, working on the education systems, predicting when public safety events may happen. In the city of Toulouse right now, we're analyzing social media to give the city government insights into its citizens, so actually creating a democratic bridge in some ways. So there's some really great work. Also, European level, we've been involved in the Human Brain Project, so DG Research has really been looking at these issues from a very positive dimension. I think the challenge is that in creating the right regulatory framework, I think in Europe we do tend to look at data and digital generally from a rather negative kind of mindset. And I think that really has to change, and that has to change pretty rapidly. If you consider that the data protection regulation says that a company can only collect the data they need to use, and they need to limit it to the purposes it was originally intended to be collected for, that clearly runs contrary to many of the benefits of big data. We don't know why that data may be useful in the future, and it's that kind of innovation and vibrancy I think the GDPR is going to stifle in Europe. And I just hope at the implementation phase we can look again at some of these things. If I was a major bank or retailer and I really wanted to use data to become the most competitive bank or retailer I could become, I would look at the GDPR in a rather negative sense. And I think the whole debate around safe harbor has also kind of polluted the environment a little bit, that somehow, the glass is half empty rather than half full when it comes to data. If I could just return to a more positive note, I think we have some great opportunities ahead of us through the DSM package and some of the things we're anticipating this year. I think firstly the DSM package is very positive in its tone. I'd like to commend Kaya for the parliamentary report she did on DSM, which I think also is very positive. But when you think about the digital transformation of industry in Europe, and I think Europe should probably stop trying to think we can have the next Google or Amazon, and we should focus on our strength, which is digital transformation. How do we apply data to our traditional industries, and how can we make them the most competitive businesses in the world? The work around ICT standards, the cloud communication, e-government action plan, free flow of data initiative, discussions around platforms, copyright, text and data mining. There are a lot of tests coming up, I think, for the EU to demonstrate that we really understand the importance of data and that we want to build an innovative economy here in Europe.
Okay, thank you very much. Kyle, I'll come to you next. You missed the intro, but you may have gathered by now that we're raking over the past, and we're trying to identify where Europe has got it right, how right we've got it, and where we've got it wrong, and how wrong we've got that bits that we have got wrong. And if you can maybe give us your quick view on this. I should introduce who you are. Of course, you're a member of the European Parliament. You serve on the Committee on Industry, Research and Energy, and on the Internal Market and Consumer Protection Committees. And you're also a member of the European Parliament Intergroup on the Digital Agenda. So,
and not less important is the fact that I come from Estonia when we talk about digital. So this is also very important. But yes, to talk as the last person on the panel is always a great challenge, as everything has been said already. But I think I will just pick up some points that also Mr. Boni referred to. That actually there are a lot of fears related to digital and data, especially. Of course, some of the issues come from our history, how we treat data and all the data protection that comes from different countries. But the question I have is that sometimes we could ask whether all this data protection discussion is a bit contaminated by the fear of economic disruption, and the fears, I think, are very important to understand that there are a lot of fears related to this. One is the fear of economic disruption, really. On different aspects and different sectors of business. But the other fear, what I also see in the debates very much, is the fear of US dominance. I think this is also a fear that we have to overcome and to be more, put more emphasis on the strengths that we have in Europe. Exactly the digitalization of industry, all the health issues, for example, the digital solutions there these are the places we could be the drivers, and I think also that we should not underestimate the role of governments here. And I'm not saying that the government should do this and that, but I'm more saying about data that for example, governments should lead by example, make the data open.
That's
yes.
my next question.
Yeah.
Government in the next question. But
Okay, but just few remarks to be first one on the panel, not the last one. So the government and what is important here, one is of course all the data that the government gathers and how to make it open, and the other side of this is also the services that the governments provide and the e-identity, because this is all for the take-up of the digital life and services in the internet. So if the government leads by example, then the companies follow as well. And the last point I want to mention is that sometimes when we see the discussions about data, and especially big data, what I see very worrying now in the European Parliament is that very often more proposals are made that the people should be able to withdraw their data. But if you think of in practice, what does it mean really? If it is big data and it's not personalized in any way, and the person says that I don't want my data to be in that pool, how can he or she withdraw that data, and what does it really mean if the companies have to create such a possibility that, okay, I'm not counting you in that pool? So basically, I think the other approach would be more open. Like if you compare with the US, again, US has taken this a very strict view on this, and to have this closed data for companies, and they are much ahead in processing data in that respect. But when we look at the European companies and governments, we should aim at openness, and because you can create innovation on the basis of other innovations and other data. So I think this is the way to go.
I want to actually run through the next couple of questions probably a little more quickly, but actually on the, and then I think because there's a question coming up I want to ask a little bit later towards the end, which I think is kind of my favorite question. But the next two questions, I mean, one is, the next question really is this question about the role of government. We tend to think of governments as having a role in things like education and skills, but also obviously in making itself smart as well. You know, government has to be kind of do its own thing with data innovation, and of course in creating infrastructures that maybe a market would not create, maybe such as through R&D or implementing pilot projects. So the question is have Europe's governments understood the opportunity at a member state level, or do we agree what the responsibility of government, what is the responsibility of government? Do we agree on that? And maybe if you can give me some insights from your own country. Michael, we'll start with you. If you have any insights, from your own experience about this, what's the role of government in all this?
Thank you. I don't remember now, probably it was in 2012. We have decided on this kind of implementation of reuse directive, and it was developed after the changes in this directive, which allowed to people and also to business for using all those data, public information, also for commercial purposes without any paying. And I think this is very important, yes, because we have discussed and we have said, okay, those public data was established due to the taxation system. So this is public money. So public purpose should be at first. And I think that this is a good direction. The second point is related to healthcare area, and I think that many European countries will be much more cautious because of the sensitivity of the personal data of patients, yes? But we need to find the solution for all over shift paradigm at the area of healthcare. But I think that openness is very important, and also openness, as Kaya mentioned, at the area of governance, yes? Because this is transparency, and this is accountability, and this is the way for making citizens as a participants during the processes of, during the decision-making processes.
Okay. Kaya, you spoke a little bit about government. Do you have any view about what the role of government is overall?
Well, yes, some of the comments I already made, but I guess your question, how do member states treat these issues? I think as there are 28 different member states, there are 28 different approaches, and I can't, of course, talk about them all as I don't know, but I can say that in Estonia we have taken this approach that government should lead by example, and also what I mentioned, that make also all these kind of services that make people take up the digital identity and such things. So the example I always bring is the taxation part. So if you file taxes online, actually you don't really have to do anything because it's all pre-filled, and you can actually compete by doing it really fast. And 96% of people in Estonia did it by online decline last year. It will definitely be higher number this year. And I think also the difference is, of course, we are small and we are flexible, but we have sort of our people, us, we have been sort of like test rabbits for different services. I don't know if it is correct way to say it, but I don't think we are very unhappy about this. Of course, you have to make sure that nobody is left behind. But if it makes life better and easier to access, then why not?
Okay. John, in the UK, obviously, generally speaking, the UK has been associated with a slightly smaller government approach to things, at least historically. At least maybe I'm remembering back too long ago. Where do you think government fits into all this?
Well, I was fortunate enough to be around in the UK when we were setting up the Open Data Institute, and I think that was, we were cutting some new ground then. And not long after that, must have been about 4 years ago, I suppose, I was at an open data conference in Potsdam. I think you were there, Michael. We were looking at this issue across Europe, and there were two things struck me. One is some governments were playing the game. In other words, they were doing things like publishing the data in PDF format. Not a lot of use, really, is it? And the other thing that really struck me was how many governments thought that this was a tool not for economic growth, but for democratic transparency. And it was perhaps, somewhat arrogantly from the UK, we didn't really think that that was an issue. But in many countries in Europe, open data had a big democratic transparency aspect to it as well. And I was struck by the enthusiasm for increasingly for governments at that conference, some years ago, to share the data for those two reasons: economic growth, but also for democratic purposes.
Open data, do you think generally, anybody can answer this question, but do you think generally, Liam, open data, is it a source of a lot of potential business initiatives in Europe? What's the balance? Is it going to do us more good in business terms or more good in economic transparency terms or democratic transparency terms, rather?
I think all of those things, Paul, and yes, we're a huge supporter of open data. There are also going to be some exceptions to that, in the research field, for example, when there is IP attached, you're not going to throw all of that open immediately. If I could just maybe return to your previous question about are policymakers getting this right at national level? Maybe this needs to be said, and maybe it's self-evident, but when you're talking about digital innovation, very new sectors of the economy, sometimes policymakers can help by not doing something rather than doing something. And I feel that in Europe, particularly in Brussels, there is this feeling that we have to do something. And actually, you see this in the sharing economy discussions taking place right now. You just sense around Europe there is an itchiness to do something about this, to regulate. Sometimes maybe we just need to see how this develops for a couple of years and observe where gaps need to be plugged, where we need to support certain parts of our economy that are being overly disrupted. But let's not rush to regulation. And I just sense that sometimes there is this feeling, particularly in this town, that we have to regulate things as almost a matter of principle.
Okay, I'll go to Michael next and then Kyle.
I agree and disagree, because I think that in those new areas we need rules. It doesn't mean that we need strong regulation in every digital area. So I think it is important for policymakers and for all partners that we should discuss on framework, regulatory and non-regulatory framework. And among regulatory framework, we have many possibilities as strong regulation, but also soft rules, as code of conduct, for example, as we established in Europe at the area of health with participation of all stakeholders. And this is going forward, and this is better to have this kind of rules than no rules, and also it's better than to have strong regulation which can stop the technological development. And also there are many possibilities of co-regulation, self-regulation, and I think that we need to go in this direction in Europe when we are talking about data innovation. When I'm talking now with people from universities on open science, for example, and they are talking about some kind of compute commons, as it was some years ago, or at the area of copyright, yes? Compute commons means that they are open for sharing the results of many analytical work done and based on processing the data with anonymization, with pseudonymization, but they are open for opening. They are open for sharing this data.
But they have a framework.
Yeah.
Yes, I just wanted to comment on those new areas of business. I think, I'm a liberal, so I'm totally supporting this idea that you don't need rules when you don't need rules, and everything works. But the problem right now is that the old rules are actually hindering the new innovation. So that's the problem. And then we should look into, because all these things that people actually like about, for example, sharing economy, the rules that are in place currently are obstacles for such services. So what happens is that in member states they are forbidden. So you can't really do all these things. I think what is very important to understand from the government side is that to ask questions. Okay, what are the problems we need to overcome? For example, sharing economy. If the question is, are they paying taxes? Let's create them possibilities to pay taxes. Again, when everything is digital, it's just one click and it goes to the tax board as well. It's just so easy, but you have to step from the administration side, you have to step forward and provide these solutions as well.
Can I ask you, the 95 directive, data protection directive, allows for codes of practice, I think at a member state level. I co-wrote one with the Data Protection Commissioner in Ireland about insurance, for example, some years ago. But it always seemed to me that the codes of practice was a route to provide a framework for innovation. That was a sort of a theory I had, and I used to say this to people, and they looked at me sort of blankly, didn't,
Yeah, that's one possibility. But also, on the other hand, we have to look that in the member states there are clear rules for different services, and they don't take into account the digital development. So if they don't, and they actually just forbid them or don't allow them, then we have to make the rules so that they actually follow the real life, that people like and use those services.
That's great. Okay, I want to come to my next question, which is, to me, it's the fun question. Maybe you mightn't agree. And I want to sort of ask about whether Europe's position as a centre for innovation has suffered from a lack of general economic reform. We don't really have that liberal a market in services in Europe, certainly not as liberal as the US. Our services directive didn't really go anywhere. And there's always a sense that the single market can be a kind of a hostage to powerful national interests and national interest groups who don't want their industry disrupted. So my question was, could the DSM even itself be a sort of escapism whereby we think that the digital economy can circumvent inflexibilities in traditional sectors that we don't have the will to face up to? And I want you to bear in mind, I think what's already been said by a couple of you, that most of the benefits of the data revolution, digital revolution, are going to come to traditional sectors in Europe. So there, I want you to, I'd like to address that. And I think maybe if I'll start with Liam.
Okay, Paul. I think sometimes we have a bit of a downer on ourselves about the single market. I think we've made immense progress as the EU in creating a single market. There is still room to go. Digital single market, energy union, capital markets union, that's for sure. But if you think about free movement of people across the EU and what that means for the digital sector, the fact that we can source skills from across the continent, I think that's a huge achievement and one we shouldn't underestimate. And by the way, there is real pressure on some of these fundamental things we have taken for granted right now. The migration crisis leading to stresses on Schengen, the Brexit discussion. I think now is the time actually to restate the importance of the single market and why that is important for sectors like ours. And that's what we want to do.
Okay. Michal. Very briefly, I think that there is no opportunity for economic and social development in Europe without a single market in general. And especially in digital single market, because internet is cross borders, and I think that we need to adjust to it. I understand all threats and all fears presented by some member states, but I think that we need to work very hardly with our governments as a representative of European Parliament. But this is the only way for the future, because this is the way for building our future competitive advantages. Those future competitive advantages should be and will be related to data processing, to data-driven economy. This is the future of the whole economy, of the whole economy. So I think this is the only way, and I think that step by step, yes. Kaja was the leader of our work in European Parliament on digital single market report. And this is very interesting because in some areas it is full of brave ideas. In some areas this is rather cautious understanding of the situation, but this cautious understanding of the situation is related probably to the critical mass among representatives of all member states. But it means that if we will discuss and work 1 year in 2017, for example, on some aspects, we will be much more brave and we will be much open for going forward together.
Kai, I'll come to you next.
I must say that British sense of humor is funny, because if the question was funny, then I didn't get it. Yeah, but to come to your question, I think, as also was mentioned already, that all this single market, although it doesn't really work properly even right now, then it's under huge pressure. We just had in our internal market committee, we had a presentation of a report showing the costs that the Schengen not being there will bring. So there are huge costs, and all these things that we take for granted because we are so used to them. They are just if they go, then you understand that we actually had something already. And of course, I think it's also what was mentioned before is that the fears are here, and the fears are the ones we have to combat in the regulator side as well. The fears of this market really working, and all the fears regarding digital. And I think what is also interesting is that if we put a question right now asking the question that what is the share of, for example, electric economy? So everybody would laugh that what kind of question is that, because everything is related to electricity nowadays in economy. But I think in few years time, if somebody would ask the same about digital, then this question would be also absurd, because everything is related to digital.
Okay, I think what I was kind of getting at in a way was that if Uber had started off in Estonia, how far beyond the border of Estonia would they have got, given the lack of reform in the services market? And it is quite a serious issue for us, I think.
But there are some services which started in Estonia and got quite far. For example, Skype, it started in Estonia, so there is hope there still, even so. And when we focus on the things that we got right and went global from even Europe, so I think we should look at it from that side, optimistic being that.
Well, I was going to be less polite than you. I was going to say, if that's your idea of a fun question, Paul, you need to get out more.
Bond villain.
Indeed. Definitely. Just a couple of things. Just your point about the electricity economy. I mentioned that to someone from India the other day, and they said that an SME in India is 5 people with electricity or 20 people without electricity. So it still sort of figures in the, in the classifications in India. I thought it was quite interesting that when David Cameron came out and gave his little speech about I've got a deal and, I'm going to be fighting for that deal, one of the things he referred to was the completion of the services market. I was listening carefully to see if he'd mentioned the digital single market, and he didn't, but he mentioned the services market. I think I'm right in saying there are 37,000 national rules and regulations still that impede the single services market. And I think, when I talk to people, say medium-sized companies doing business across Europe, they somewhat ironically say, I've become an expert in labour law in 28 different countries now because, and the truth is that whilst I agree with Liam entirely that, we've made fantastic progress. When I was a boy, it wasn't safe to drink the water in France. Now it's not safe to drink the water in the UK, apart from in those places where it's managed by French companies. But no, but it was, it was really, we have come such a long way. And just to point to this sort of regulatory instincts on this policy forum I've been running for the Commission. I feel like every 2 weeks I've had to take on an argument about we need regulation here, we need regulation there, and when you unpick it, it's almost like a code for we need to do something and I don't know what to do, therefore we need some regulation. But actually when you unpick it, you don't really, because you've not well enough defined the fact that there is something that requires a regulatory solution.
Okay, I want to just do 2 more things. One is we've got about 20 minutes left, and I want to ask you a quick question, and then I want to ask the audience after that, people here present have any questions they want to put to the panel. But the question is, I've been to a couple of events recently about digital single market and innovation, and at both of these events, it's been stated that capital markets union or reform of European capital markets, in fact, is critical to certainly developing European players in technology and startups and technology. And and this isn't really about having a European Google or European Facebook, but if we were going to have European Google or European Facebook, it begs the question, are the capital markets there in Europe to help these companies? So maybe if I can go to Liam, or whoever wants this question, but Liam, we'll try you first, and if anybody else wants to jump in afterwards, with a view.
A lot has been said about how difficult it is to raise venture capital in Europe compared to California, the growth in Silicon Valley. And I think that's true, and I think the Capital Markets Union would certainly help that situation. Maybe it's a bit unfair. IBM is a big company, and we work with lots of small, medium-sized companies in our ecosystem here in Europe. And we see some great innovation models. We do what we can to assist these companies to scale. I think of a German SME with a rather unfortunate name. It's called SICK, S-I-C-K. But this is a very interesting company that we did an IoT project with. We allowed them to scale globally using sensors to track packages to the point where they're now working with DHL, they're working with FedEx. And we do hear across our ecosystem that Europe is more difficult than the US to raise venture capital in our sector, and that is something that our policymakers, I think, seriously need to address.
I ran a startup in the 90s, and I raised money in the UK and in the US, and I didn't find it difficult to raise money in the UK. But I do know that the figures, that in Europe, it tends to be more. I think it's 2-to-1 banks as opposed to the other way around, sort of US to Europe in terms of bank loan, and. I remember during those startup days going to see one of the major banks and them saying to me, well, what's the banking proposition that you have for us? In other words, they have an entirely different approach. It's not really risk capital in quite the same way. We'll give it a go and see how it goes. Not at all. With banking, it's very much, what's the banking proposition? What's my return on investment? Oh, it's quite a narrow risk band I can go for. So that is clearly going to make it more difficult.
Can we have your house?
Yeah, and can we have your house? And if not, can we have your mother's? And so it's clearly going to make it more difficult to raise money when you're going through a sort of banking style system as opposed to a genuine we'll take a gamble type system.
To address this.
But the background of these difficulties is related to the cultural pattern of banking system in Europe. because we are not open for failures. In the US, after failure, you can go to the bank, ask for the money, and they are talking and they are speaking to you that, okay, probably you will have your lessons learned. Okay. In Europe, there are many problems, so I think we need to change it. We need to establish much more venture capital, and also we need to understand that now it is new, 2 or 3, 4 years. We have startups in Europe, and they are very active, and they are open for risky undertakings. But on the other hand, there are many financial institutions which are open for financing their activity.
Okay, I want to go to Kaya briefly, and then...
Well, actually, I wanted to say practically the same thing about the risk-prone culture that we don't have. So that is also reflected in the financing part. We are treating failure a different way, and this is a mentality issue. So I very much welcome different approaches in different member states. For example, Finland, they have the failure day, the 13th of October, where they celebrate failure to just give this message that it's okay to fail. And in Europe, we see that if you have to succeed 100%, and also the banks take it the same way, that we are giving you money if you succeed, but we are not taking the risk if you fail, and we need to change that. Okay.
Are there any questions out there? Anybody amongst our guests have any questions for the panel? We do have a microphone somewhere. It's always hard to be the first one, but there must be somebody with some questions, unless you feel it's all been covered. Sir.
Yeah, I do appreciate your note about the necessity to have new functions such as chief data officer. I would like to give an input from private sector. You know that private sector goes fast, and there are a lot of new functions, not only chief data officer, because I would see that chief data officer is more about data and data governance, but you see chief article officer, chief data scientist, per sector, per domain. And so I wonder if there should be a reflection, and even in government, that there are many new functions to be established, and indeed also trainings for that, to train to grow leaders.
So you think that the chief data officer idea is a good idea,
yeah, but enough.
But not enough?
Yeah, in a sense, yeah.
And who are you addressing that question to me, or any of the...
It's your recommendation.
Yeah.
It's our recommendation, I guess. Yeah, I mean, you were so polite. Well, I guess from our point of view, I mean, the reason why we suggested it was because we think that there's a need for member states and European institutions to be very much on the same page about the whole innovation agenda in Europe, and that we need something in the member states to counterbalance perhaps some of the politicization that takes place of the data innovation agenda around questions like disruption, around questions like privacy, which are in danger of taking down reforms. And so our view on this is that if, for example, one member state is toying with the idea of banning a whole technology, then I think the idea is that if there is a chief data officer in that member state, that would be that would be a person to whom one could appeal, and that was what motivated us to sort of think in those terms, to actually have a, if you excuse the expression, a platform for innovation across Europe.
Well, I would support that. I think I know what you're getting at here, and I referred earlier to the fact that during the whole GDPR debate, which took 4 years, in my view, there was a depressing lack of input from economic ministries and ministries of industry into this debate. It was almost like a cocoon debate of data privacy professionals, ministries of justice. And I think these issues are far too important to be left in that cocoon. I think we need to widen it, and we need to have a really comprehensive, open economic discussion about the power of data. And I think if this is one of the proposals which would get governments thinking about the glass half full rather than the glass half empty, I think it's a very, very credible proposal.
Okay, and actually there are, I'm just trying to figure out whether there's a roving mic. I thought there was a roving mic, but there are microphones in your chairs, in the armrests of your chairs. And if you wanted to ask a question, you can pull it out and turn it on. But I thought that we should have a roving mic. But we have 2 roving mics, so cancel that last suggestion. Are there any other questions? Because we do have a few minutes. We do have some time for another question. Sorry, sir, yes. It's Leonard.
Thank you. Niklas Anzinger from a technology startup in Berlin. My question is to Kaya. Since Estonia has been such a great example of, riding on the technology wave, I'd be very interested in what you think. Since we're speculating on the questions, what can the government do? What role does regulation play? How can the private sector develop best? What do you think explains Estonia's success story in those terms?
Well, I think one issue definitely here is that we are small and flexible. So we took it up. Like seeing all the opportunities there and not the challenges, which is what I've noticed in European Parliament, and which was a big surprise for me when I came here, is that, for example, a lot of German colleagues, they only talk about risks, and it's all black and it's all so bad. For example, when we had the discussion about health, and I described the e-prescription that we have and how good it is actually that 100% of people use the online prescription to get their medication from the pharmacy, no papers, no bad handwriting of doctors, nothing like this. And people from other parts of Europe, they went like, oh, but you go to the most sensitive data that there is, health data. Yes, but it's also the data that helps the people the most. So this is the change of or point of views. It's totally different whether you see it from this side as an opportunity or totally as a risk. And when we talk about health, then you can have the data on paper and you never know who looks at it, whereas when you have it on internet or online, then you can see who has been looking at your data. So these are the things that I think these are different approaches in the political mindset as well.
Please, yes, go ahead.
So I talked recently to somebody who was called the Chief Medical Data Officer, right? So you've got your Chief Data Officer, but Chief Medical Data Officer for Kaiser Permanente, who were a $56 billion not-for-profit in the US. And he was explaining how they have consolidated a single electronic patient record within the Kaiser Permanente organization. They said the real benefit to them is that they can, within 24 hours, get new medical treatments out of their frontline doctors because they can detect things in that volume of data, like don't use this therapy with those drugs. And they can tell, almost instantly and get new instructions out to their front line. And I think he combines that medical knowledge and the data knowledge. It's really I thought that was quite remarkable.
There's a gentleman here. Sir, yeah.
Yes, Max von Neuenhusen with Novartis. My mother recently had to go into the hospital because she had a broken ankle. And I was with her and we were asking the hospital administrator, what is actually your record in terms of antimicrobial infection in the hospital? And they said, oh, we are not better or no worse than any other. Cut a long story short, and 6 months down, she had a lot of nasty infections, etc. And the doctor said, and the surgeon in the end said, you know what, you were lucky, we didn't have to amputate. She's 79. Anyway, we don't have health data at the moment at all. And if you look at actually the outcomes variation in terms of if you go for surgery into any hospital, we don't have access to the data, either as administrators at the national level or the European level, or as a patient, if you want to know how good or bad your hospital is performing.
In America, they put restaurant health reports from the health inspectors online. So maybe we need that in health in hospitals.
You know, transparency and that is extreme transparency is one thing. But if insurances were able to check that data and say, actually, here that hospital in this part of Spain, actually, their adverse events for, let's say, prostate cancer in terms of incontinence and other stuff is actually below 5%, and this one is at 85%. Maybe we should have a look at the one with 85% incontinence rates after surgery and check them out, what they're doing very badly. And we don't have that ability of learning right now in Europe, but we know we have that health outcome variation right now.
Are there any more? Sorry, Mikhail.
I fully agree, and this is important, but on the other hand, it is very difficult because the member states have competences at the area of health. And they are not so open now for sharing the data, also in the countries, yes? So I think that it is very important to have the roadmap to this shift paradigm at the healthcare area, because sharing the data, using the data, processing the data can completely change the model of medical services and make it much more personalized, with using many references point, as you mentioned, yes, for better therapies, yes. And I think that this is the way for us, and we need to make it.
Okay, Kaya?
Just a small comment on following this up. About health data. All these big data innovations can help in that regard, and I really like this example that Commissioner Ansip often brings about this, him getting an SMS that Mr. Ansip, please go to the hospital. You are going to have a heart attack in 5 hours. So he said that he doesn't like the SMS, but it saves his life. So eventually, it's all good.
Thank you. Okay. I think we've time for maybe a very quick question, if anybody has a quick question, or I'm happy to wrap it up. Okay, I think in that case, on that very happy note, I'd like to thank my panel, John Higgins of Digital Europe, Michael Boni, Lean Benham of IBM, and Kaya Kallas. Thank you very much indeed.
Great, we're going to move right into the second panel, so I'd like to invite our second set of panelists to go ahead and make their way up here. Great. Yes, please. Yes, we are doing that right now. So if you're waiting to see where you're going to sit, I'll read out the orders. Everyone knows. Leonard Kauschwitz at the end, Philippe Van Imp next to him, Victor Negresco, thank you, Katrina Meehan, and then Beatrice Kovasi and Damir right here on my right. For those of you that came in after we began, I just want to do a quick reminder. We're tweeting using the hashtag data innovation. You'll see there's a lot of engagement there. You're also welcome to ask questions via Twitter. We'll try and do some response and pull any questions that we see from there as well. And we'll get started right now. Let's see. Beatrice is coming up. Can you do that? Thank you. Thank you. Good to see you. Great. So what we want to do with this panel is really look at how we move forward with data innovation. In the last panel, we've talked a lot about the challenges that we've seen to date, some of the conflicts that we've had, where things have gone well, where things have been a little more difficult. On this panel, we really want to look at how do we move forward when we look at the benefits of data-driven innovation. How do we build the consensus to move forward? How do we, what are the right policies that we need to be focusing on right now? What should be at the top of this agenda? So we have an excellent set of panelists here today representing this discussion. And why don't we just go ahead and jump in? I'd like to start with Beatrice, with you. Beatrice, you're the deputy head of unit for the data value chain at the European Commission. You're formerly the first counselor for the digital economy at the EU delegation to the United States. And I want to start with you because your work right now on the data value chain is, I think, really central to this question. It's really, I think, a very innovative project in that it's looking at, basically what do we need, what are the components that we need to have a data economy, and then how we fill in that gap. So I thought it'd be useful for you to kind of kick us off in this discussion by telling us a little bit about your work to date, what you found, and where the main gaps are that you see.
Sure. Thanks a lot. Does it work? Yeah. And first of all, let me say that I was really thrilled to be here because I had the privilege to be in DC when your Center for Data Innovation was launched in 2013, so in my previous capacity. And now I'm here for the inauguration of the European Center. So I think it's a great opportunity to have been witnesses in both. And of course, in the 3 years which has passed from one event to the other, so much has happened in the field of the data economy. And we see that things that were just a promise at the time are materializing increasingly also in Europe. As you mentioned, Daniel, what we are looking at is to have a holistic view of the data economy. So we need to tackle not just many of the elements which were already mentioned in the first panel from a regulatory point of view, from a framework condition point of view, but we need to tackle also, more concretely, the money for innovation. Who gives us, the tools and the instruments to have a data innovation community in Europe? And on the second point, this is very much what we are doing at the moment with our big data value, private-public partnership, which puts on the table $500 million euros. That's a Freudian slip. And basically, it will achieve, hopefully, investments for 2.5 billion overall until 2020. It is an exciting project. I'm going tomorrow at The Hague for the partnership board. And we have now the calls in Horizon 2020 just open. They will close in April with 2 new types of instruments. One looking at reaching scale in the internal market. We call it lighthouse or large-scale pilots. And the other one is called innovation spaces and aims at facilitating SMEs and new applications in this field. And if you think about scale, and if you think about the type, to give you an idea of the type of things we want to achieve, think about the largest acquisition last year in this field, which was the acquisition by the German automotive industry of Nokia Here Maps, which was an acquisition of 2.7 billion. And that's exactly what we would like economic actors to do. Think about their data sets, reflect how they can innovate in their sectors by taking also and using data sets that come from other sectors. We find this is very stimulating. And then in a nutshell also, it was mentioned in the previous panel, so I will not go into detail at this stage, but we are trying to set in place the framework conditions. Mr. Boni mentioned also non-regulatory conditions, so we have the skills very much in mind. But as you know, we have this industrial package coming out now in April. So data is a horizontal theme, which goes from European cloud infrastructure to Industry 4.0 to standardization. And then after the summer, of course, the Free Flow of Data Initiative. So a lot to discuss more into detail. I leave it here for the moment. But.
Thank you. No, that's a great start. Next, I want to turn to Victor Negrescu, who's an MEP joining us. Beatrice, your initial remarks, I think, about bringing me back to 2013 when we first started this, it was interesting because when we first started the center, we had to spend a lot of time talking to policymakers just about what the benefits of data were. They didn't really understand it at all. There was really no understanding of the possible economic and social benefits. And I think we have moved quite far in 3 years, and that there's more recognition. But Victor, you've seen this a little more up close and personal than probably a lot of other people. And I like your comments on that and how you see the debate actually evolving over time and what more we need to do in terms of just kind of pure education.
Yeah, what I love about this type of debate and when referring to ICT or to data in general is that here in Europe we tend to say everything's fine. We have the rules, we have the people, we have entrepreneurship, but I come from the business world. Before becoming an MEP, I used to run companies that had more than 1,000 employees in the ICT sector, and I can tell you, everything is not fine. We do not know how we can work across Europe with regards to the use of data. We do not know how we can engage with the European Commission in order to develop the businesses that we have. We do not know how we can invest better in our employees by using European funds. So everything's not fine, in my opinion. So things have been done in the last few years, but Europe is still lacking the capacity to be competitive with regards to other countries, and especially the United States. We are investing not enough money in what is the ICT sector. We are not doing enough for stimulating people to learn more about ICT skills. The fact that the European Commission recognizes the fact that by 2020 we are going to be lacking around 1 million people in the ICT means that we aren't doing enough. So in my opinion, these type of debates are essential because this type of debates should bring also solutions, not only simple remarks to things that may happen or pretending that everything is fine. And what I believe we should do is to try to define better the rules of the game. Because for now, with regards to data, we tend to say that we have common regulations, but in reality, we don't have common regulations. We tend to say that we interpret the law in the same way across Europe, but we do not do so. So what I believe we should do is to try to find solutions for people to have better information to how data can be useful for them to create businesses, to create jobs, to develop the educational system, because not everyone knows about it. In my opinion, if we refer to ICT skills in general, more than 60% of Europeans do not know how ICT skills can help them. If we ask them about how data could help them, we'll find out that around only 10% of Europeans actually know how data can be useful in their daily lives. So I think we have to do a lot of work in terms of information, in terms of communication, in terms of involving the business sector, the NGOs, the people from the public sector, involve everyone in a big debate across Europe, because otherwise Europe is losing at the end, and we are still going to meet here and pretend everything's fine.
Thank you. I want to bring in Leonard and Katrina on this discussion. Leonard Kauschwitz is the Director for European Affairs for Allied for Startups, and Katrina Behan is with the Application Developers Alliance. Both of you are seeing, working with companies that are in the startup mode, that are looking at these new opportunities around data. What challenges are you seeing in those businesses? What are are there areas where we're seeing particular successes here in Europe? And what do you think needs to change? Why don't we start with you, Katrina?
Yeah, sure. So firstly, thanks for inviting me. I'm delighted to be here. So I am the Policy Director for the Application Developers Alliance. We're a non-profit global membership organization that advocates for developers as creators, innovators, and entrepreneurs. So when we're speaking today about a data-driven economy, I think that the innovation side of that is hugely important. And one thing that I'd like to note is that in the EU, we do actually have a lot of innovation. We have some great ideas of people developing products that are great. And I think that your report really showed some great examples of how the EU is leading in things like smart cities, even healthcare, all of those areas. So we do have that, and it's important as well from our perspective to realize why app developers need data and how they're using it. And in many cases, we'll see that what they want to do, and in most cases actually, they want to make their products better. They want to improve user experience. So what they're trying to achieve with the use of data is actually in line with what consumers would like as well. So what we want to make sure is that the environment is conducive to that, and so that startups and developers aren't being held back by over-prescriptive regulation or perhaps outdated laws as well. So what we really want to do is ensure that the environment is right and that businesses can thrive.
Excellent. Leonard, let me invite you to comment on this topic as well.
Thanks, yeah, and maybe I can, adding to that, I absolutely agree, and maybe a couple of positive and good notes on that, because we actually think it's been never a better time in Europe to create a new startup, and we have a steady increase in funding in startups, which is also a very good sign, and not lastly, the fact that we're sitting here and discussing data and startups, and we recognize startups as the drivers often of those of this digital economy is, I think, is a huge step forward. And also startups themselves, they care much more about policy as they did before. So I think if you look 2 years back, there has not been a policy advocacy group in Brussels discussing startups. So I think in that sense, it's very positive development. But then, of course, maybe if we look at startups, and they are hugely diverse startups, mostly the sum of the decisions that the people that run startups make, and maybe compared to more traditional forms of business, startups are the most mobile companies that we know, and during the first couple of years, it's not unusual that a startup asks itself a couple of times where it should establish and where it should do its business. And you mentioned that earlier. It is much about the landscape that we find in Europe and the question whether we want to do our business here or elsewhere. So I think this is something where we can also see very quickly how the landscape in Europe is perceived. And maybe one or two sentences to what we do. We are really here, and I wanna second what Mr. Negrescu said to foster this dialogue, because we have great ideas and we have great companies in Europe, and I think key is often that those ideas are published and make note a bit more better, and in the end also that policymakers understand what it is about. So.
Thank you. Philippe, let me invite you in on this as well. I think there's probably two areas that you can start commenting on. One, and just I'll say again, Philippe Van Eeps, the founder of the Brussels Data Science Community and the European Data Innovation Hub. So you're helping address some of these skill challenges by creating this hub and creating these learning opportunities. But you're also seeing firsthand companies that are, entrepreneurs that are in their startup phases that are dealing with these data challenges. So I'd like to hear your reaction for what are the main constraints that the people you work with are facing right now, and what do you want policymakers to hear from them about how they can help address those issues?
I think one of the main issue is that if a startup has to think about where he should establish himself in Europe, that's already a bad move, because he shouldn't think about it. That should be obvious that wherever he goes, it should be the same. Yeah, it's not the case, but that would be ideal. Whenever a startup thinks that he should try to find a way to get some money from the government, to get funding and things like that, I think that's also a wrong thing, because the major companies should be there to buy from startup. These companies should be motivated to help the the innovation driven by startups to finance those innovations by buying from them normally, yeah, which is not the case either. And I would also like to stress the fact that when we're thinking about a place where startup could feel comfortable, well, that place should be a place where the whole ecosystem is there. You should not put a startup where only a public organization is present. No, you should put a startup where the whole ecosystem is there, where you have innovators there, other startups, but also academic people present. And this is the whole ecosystem. An ecosystem for startups is not only a big company and a few government instances. It's the whole. It's much wider, and you have to include academic people in there as well.
Thank you. And Damir Tomicic is as CEO of Axonom, and you've obviously gone through personally, some of these issues, creating the company, leading the company in this area. What advice would you give to others that are starting off in this area that want to create the next, big data company? And maybe they don't even, they're not thinking of themselves as a data company. Maybe they're not really thinking of themselves as tech. They're in another industry, but they're going to be using, tech as a key differentiator. What advice would you give to them, and what do you think? What advice would you give to the policymakers about how to help them?
In our case, it's really funny because we have companies in 3 countries. In Germany, which is obviously huge on data protection and privacy. In Estonia, which is huge on innovation. And in the US, for the same reason. I'm really grateful for the opportunity to share my experience with you. But just to make a small comparison and give you an example from real life, I'm not a professional cook, but I love cooking. And after 15 years of trying, meanwhile, I consider myself a decent cook. And that cooking is a lot about try and explore, experimenting. You start cooking and things go terribly wrong. And that's very, very similar to being an entrepreneur. You start something, you try something, and what is really negative in Europe, or different in the US, is what you mentioned with this try and error and negative attitude among people. As an entrepreneur in Europe, you have just one chance. If you fail, that's it. So people just put a mark on you and you failed. And this is something that really needs to change in Europe, because we need a new way of thinking. Because generation before me got a PC as an excitement, as a new thing. My generation got internet, we changed the world. This generation today get data. And I can really tell you, data is the next big thing. Decision-making process among entrepreneurs is based on gut feeling today. Tomorrow, it will be based on facts. I would love to decide on facts, not on my gut feeling. If I invest in one thing or invest in another thing, it's much, much better if I have a clear understanding on what's going on. And if we build solutions for customers and the customers really understand consumers, they will invest more freely. And I think the whole, environment in Europe would be more vibrant and more positive towards entrepreneurs. And this is what, my advice for the entrepreneurs would be, don't be afraid. What we did learn from our US colleagues, they just try. They are not risk-aware as we are. And this previous panelist mentioned this failure appreciation day. I heard it for the first time. I love it. It's very something that needs to be introduced in every country for everyone. And also, if an entrepreneur, young entrepreneur, starts studying in Europe, he should start thinking about building a company, starting a company, and not like in Germany, like 90% of the guys dreaming about becoming a leader of Siemens, of a huge company, and ruling the world from this corporate side. And innovation is mostly coming from small companies, from entrepreneurs, and I think that's what we need in Europe.
Thank you. That's a great segue into, I think, an additional conversation on this. I did see that I think France recently had one of their first failcons, specifically to get the idea where you bring together a bunch of people to talk about their failures as opposed to their successes, because that's a great learning opportunity. But I want to stay on this idea about the kind of the risk averseness that we see in I think startups and companies that are thinking about new products, even if it's not a startup. There's I think a belief that these fears hold back companies from building products. On the first panel, Emblem was brought up, a startup in the United States, a nonprofit startup that was created to provide educational data technology to schools. And it met so much political resistance that it basically failed. And this, of course, set back personalized learning efforts in the United States by at least 3 years. I mean, we're 3 years later, we haven't actually made progress there. And I think there's this similar type of concern that pervades a lot of thinking in the private sector, where nobody wants to be the first one. In economics term, this is called the penguin effect, where you have a bunch of hungry penguins huddled around the ice, and no one wants to be the first one to dive in because they don't know what's down there. And so you have these hungry penguins. And so the question is, do we have that same phenomena going on here, where we have a lot of interest and excitement, but there's a hesitancy to be the first one. There's this risk averseness that keeps companies away. And how do we overcome that? So I'll just open this up to anyone who wants to jump in. Yep.
So I think I'm actually not quite sure whether we have this hesitance. Maybe we don't have it, and we have these companies coming, but then they get slammed and get into legal trouble and disappear again. So I'm not quite sure how this runs, but I'd like to make one example with the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation, where I think one way forward could be that, or would be that we'd wish that the regulator, the data protection authorities, actually would make an effort to understand the data business or the startup business a bit better, because how it will roll out and how it will work after 2018 is that data processing in principle has to go through an impact assessment, and if it's declared risky data processing, then we would need an additional consultation procedure through that. And these are all fields where companies and data processors and startups, of course, work together with data protection authorities and have to get a go in the end to launch their product, even if in a beta version, which is quite frustrating, actually. But I think one way of overcoming this would be making sure that data protection authorities really understand the data-driven business, and we would make sure that they also see those opportunities and recognize finally their economic role in making this possible or not.
Thank you. Yes.
Yeah. Actually, I wanted to react to some of the things that you said and that the other panelists also mentioned. So first of all, I do not believe that the problem in Europe is to start a business. The problem is to make it bigger. The incapacity to attract funds after a certain period of time, the incapacity to go to other markets across Europe, because it is hard to understand regulations and understand legislation. The pressure exercised by the big companies, a lot of them European companies, also smaller players. So this is the problem that I believe businesses face across Europe. And in relation to the problem of risk, another problem is that the risk is not the same everywhere in Europe. So a Danish young entrepreneur doesn't face as many risks as a French entrepreneur or the Romanian entrepreneur, because he gets better protection. So sometimes we should use the best examples to implement them across Europe, but sometimes we have to have a fair competition among entrepreneurs across Europe. And someone mentioned here that data is the next big thing. In my opinion, it's not only about data. It's about the capacity to understand data. This is the next big thing, because it's not so easy. The thing is not only to have access to it, it's to know how to use it, it's to know how to interpret it, to know how to, you can transform information into business, in something that is useful for you every day. And I'm again referring to my former experience as an entrepreneur. I used to work in the outsourcing business, so data is very important there. So knowing how to get data is also very important. So some of these questions need to be answered, and this information has to be delivered to people that want to work in this field. I mean, young people, but also people that are already working in different sectors that want to improve themselves. We don't have this capacity across Europe to help people improve themselves and understand how data is useful for them. Because if we do not know how to read it, we do not know how it works, and at the end, we are only talking about flows of information, but not useful ones for making business and creating jobs.
Thanks. Let me just, elaborate a bit on this, because I'm a bit less maybe pessimistic on that on that front, in the sense that at least we are trying to put at this moment, in place the right conditions. And I wanted to go back to the idea of having, an ecosystem. The word ecosystem was stressed several times. And you need, I think, two things. One, to have an ecosystem, for instance, in the upcoming industrial package that we have this idea of having digital innovation hubs. I'm sure you've heard about it in, all across the union. And in general, this is something where I think will be a good provision, but I think in general we will be obliged to reflect more about these networks effects, how to create hubs where you can have the academia, the industry, the multipliers close to each other. We have not been traditionally very good at this in Europe, or less good than other regions of the world. But then on innovation, and also to overcome this risk awareness, we need, I think, also beyond the regulatory landscape, we need to make possible, playgrounds or places where startups, especially SMEs, can experiment safely on safe grounds. So I'm thinking now in particular about Odine, which is our open data incubator, which is being quite successful. But also, as I mentioned, with the innovation funds of Horizon 2020, giving the opportunity to test some of these applications that then can be exported in the market. And third, of course, and this is a big challenge, to complete the digital single market. So that those startups, when they have a successful application, they can scale it up or take it wherever they want in Europe.
Let me ask you to expand on one point. One issue that comes up is this question of how do you take this idea of the hubs, which is very powerful, and that's where we see so much innovation, and yet obviously in the kind of EU's capacity, you're going to want to distribute funds and resources kind of everywhere. But centralization does actually have tremendous benefit, especially for competitiveness in this area. We've certainly seen that in the United States in some of our work, looking at where there are kind of hubs of data innovation. It's not that the United States is doing great everywhere. It's doing great in some places. And so I think that's a challenge that you might have. How do you basically pick who will be the leaders here?
In general, I think it's a challenge of complementarity. For instance, that's what we are trying to do, and I don't have all the details of these hubs yet, because it's something that we're just coming out with. But I take another example of another correlated field, the European Data Skills Academy. This is a project we are having where we try really to have curricula, but also to map the existing and have universities and centers for data analytics and data scientists talk to each other. So I think the challenge in Europe is not the multiplication of points, but is already the first step that those who already do good things in the data economy and for the data economy speak to each other. And in that respect, that they know that there is a complementarity, that there is, a university in Hungary being, just very specific on one topic, and maybe a center in Italy doing something else. So if we more or less, this mapping and creating more synergies across countries, it's possibly a very banal suggestion, but it's where we start from.
Yeah, Katrina.
Yeah, just going back to the risk aversion. I think it's difficult to say where the problem originates. So whether it's, as Leonard says, perhaps startups don't want to start up in Europe because of perhaps regulatory concerns, or if perhaps it is cultural and just our general view regarding failure, and that's that's definitely different in other countries. It's difficult to determine where this originates, but I do think that we can tackle it in two ways. So we can have a sort of a multiple response to it. So I think that what the Commission's doing, it won't hurt, and especially with these tech hubs, I think that that's one solution as well. And I think that we do need to change the mindset, and there are several ways to tackle it. So, yeah, it's just difficult to say where it originates.
Yes, go ahead.
I just have a last remark concerning the startups and how startups need to be intergalactic and be able to travel from one country to the other without being hindered. I like small startups, and I like the idea of having a micro organization that runs well with a few people, 5 people, 10 people. And if we continue telling the startups that they have to be intergalactic, it hinders them, because they say, oh, I won't be, if I don't have 1,000 people, then I won't be successful. If I can't sell into Asia, I will never be a success. My mother won't talk to me anymore. Or, I mean, a small startup is fine, as long as that small startup can live without too many funds from the European Commission and just live by themselves because they do a good job and they find a good company that wants to buy their services. I think that's already a good start, and that will be easier to multiply than to find that specific startup that will be intergalactic in the next 2-3 years.
Maybe I can just add to that, because I think we have a lot of those great startup ideas, but then we see that within the first 5 employees, there has to be a lawyer, and there has to be a data protection officer, and then if you want to do business in a second and a third country, you have to found your company new, you have to have a new bank account, you have to have new statutes and all that, and unfortunately, even a small startup would have an administrative overhead that is, and I think this is also what Kaya mentioned earlier about where policy is in the way of business.
Yeah, that's precisely what the hub could provide. The hub could provide all these services and allow the startup to focus on their product and to focus on their first customers. Let's the kind of hub you discussed about. Let's them organize this. You know.
I think that's a good pausing point for our conversation. It's now 4 o'clock, as I promised. We're going to be hearing now from Alexander De Croo, Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Development Cooperation and the Digital Agenda of Belgium, who will be speaking to us now and answering these questions and providing us all of the solutions. So we'd like to welcome well, please, welcome you up. Thank you. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Hi, good afternoon. I've understood that I'm the pause in this panel and could get some more drinks and air without continuing. Now, first of all, thank you for inviting me, and I'm happy to see that the title of this event does not have the word big in it. And very often when we talk about data, people always assume, well, it's big data. And I don't like the word big in data because, first of all, it's a clear reference to Big Brother and to the fact that data is actually something that we should be afraid of. That's the first element. The second element is to the point that was made just at the end, is that it implies that data is only for big companies and for multinationals and for big organizations, which is not at all the case. If you look at the way data is used today, actually with very limited infrastructure, you can do great things. And I would actually like to get rid of the word big data, because I don't think that's the point. The point of what is happening today is that it's ubiquitous data. There's data on everything and data on things that we would never ever have imagined that there would be data, and it's being collected and it can be used. It's about the fact that there is about all sorts of things data. And this is something else than the connotation of big. Now, I think that the key element, of course, in the discussion about data, especially in Europe, is what is the discussion about today? When you talk in Europe about data, 90% of the discussion is about data protection and about privacy. And I rarely have a discussion in Europe about what can you actually do with data? What's the benefit? What's the promise? It's almost like we're afraid to have that kind of discussion. And this is a criticism to corporates, to the public society, and to the political discussion. We are always talking about what could go wrong, and it's like we almost never dare to put in balance what actually you could do with that. And I think that's a pity. It's a bit comparable to the discussion that we have when we talk about platforms. When in the European scene we talk about platforms, the first reaction is about platform regulation or about breaking up some platforms or bringing some platforms in front of some European commissioner. Without pronouncing myself on whether this is a good case or not, we rarely speak about what should we do to have our own platforms. Why don't we have world-leading platforms that originate in Europe? The real reason, of course, is that if you want to have platforms, if you want to use data, you need scale. And scale, it's almost seen as that today scale can only be achieved in the United States because it has a big market. Well, actually, we have the same market. We have a bigger market. I mean, the European market is 570 million inhabitants. Unfortunately, it's not one market because the way we deal with consumer rights is different, the way we deal with copyright is different, the way we collect VAT is different, and the way we deal with data is very, very different. Now, my feeling is that if we want to have a real discussion on the promises of data and the innovation perspective and the productivity benefits of data, the key element, of course, is trust, and is trust from the general public. And actually, trust is, from my perspective, in any economic system, trust is always the element. If you don't have trust between people, you will never have an economic development. In the old economy, the instance that was bringing trust in the economy, it was governments. This is what the public service used to do, is to bring trust in an economic system by labeling, by giving stars to hotels and these types of things, or by being a little bit protectionist and making sure that certain jobs were not open for everyone. This is one of the benefits that governments would bring. If you look at the digital economy of today, trust is coming from somewhere else. In the economy of today, trust is not coming from government or from public institutions. Trust is actually something that is generated peer-to-peer. And that's a good thing. And I think the public is doing it in a much more detailed and a much more accurate way than governments or public service could do today. So the role that we as governments play in the economy of today is not to bring trust. I think we should step one step back and make sure that the peer-to-peer system can actually work in making sure that trust is in the system. However, related to data, I think there clearly, as a public authority, there is a role that we should play. If you look at what are the concerns today, well, the concerns obviously is, well, a lack of transparency, what is going to happen with my data, a lack of control. I'm okay if you are using my data, but what happens if it's being transferred from one to the other? Is data something that you should see as an asset that when it is sold from one person to the other, that actually all rights are gone? Or is this something where there's a certain stickiness related to the data that is being transferred? And lastly, and definitely not least, is lack of knowing what the benefit is about. As I said, in Europe, when we talk about data, you get a lot of discussions about what could go wrong, but we often do not give an opportunity to people who are very close to the benefit to voice what they think could be the benefit. For me, the one example is about reusing medical data. Very often this is seen as the example where we should be extremely careful and extremely restrictive on what is possible. Well, if you talk to people who are, for example, member of a patient association, for example, in chronic diseases, you will hear a very different story. They are almost crying to make their data available. They say, please, I have all this data about my health, about how I'm dealing with this chronic disease. Can you please use this data and adapt your therapy or your medication to me? And this voice we don't hear often enough. We very often hear people who are far away from the benefit talking about often what I would think theoretic problems that could exist, and do not often enough hear the persons or the institutions that could use the benefit. So what does that mean from a policy perspective? First of all, and this is a Belgian position, but we have voiced it already a few times within the Commission. If we really believe in a single European market, then any data localization requirement is something that we definitely should get rid of. I mean, if you really believe that you want to have a free flow of data within Europe, we can never accept that certain countries would say, you know, financial data needs to be within my borders, or these types of data need to be at a certain localization. I would even go further. I think the whole concept of data localization, I have to say that I find it hard to grasp. I mean, why would we still believe that the location of data is something that is important? I hope that the most important data is at different locations. I really hope that they multiply it at different locations, and that is actually quite far away. The place where something sits, for me, linking certain legal rights based on the place where something is sitting, I think that's a concept that is very much old economy, and I don't really see how it could apply here. I think that's the first element. Second element is, how do we regulate, and how do we actually do it in a flexible way? I think that the whole discussion is not so much about data. The whole discussion is actually about the algorithms. Data in itself is not something where we should be in favor or against. The whole question is, what are you actually doing with the data? Even more, one silo of data, we can say we're perfectly fine with it. Another silo of data is probably also perfectly fine. Even combining them and using it in a way that is transparent and adopting general legislation, there's not a problem. But certain types of analysis you do could be something that is discriminatory. So I think it is actually quite hard to have general rules that apply specifically to data. I think that we actually have a lot of legislation that is perfectly applicable. We have consumer protection laws, which are also actually quite pervasive and also apply to what you do with data. We have general privacy laws, which I think are quite applicable. So the whole question is, how do you make sure that the way data is being used and the way it's being analyzed and the way algorithms are being used are internally within an organization used in a way which is in line with our general legislation? I think the only way to do it, and is just to use an analogy with kind of a similar problem that we have had, I could say 50 or 60 years ago worldwide, is at the moment where food production was being industrialized. There was gigantic questions on, well, what are they doing with food to make something that we should eat, and how can we actually control that it's safe to do that? And what was being created afterwards is something which is called the Food and Drug Administration, and here in Belgium it's called the FAVV. And what authority do we give them? Well, we give them the authority to go inside, to go into a production facility, and to check and to see how food is being processed. I think we should do exactly the same with data. What we should allow to a data agency is to actually go inside, ask to audit databases, to audit certain processes, and to be able to say, okay, you know, what you're doing here we think is perfectly in line with the general consumer protection laws we have. Certain things you're doing here, this is discriminatory, this is something you're not allowed to do. That means that today what we call our privacy agencies or our data protection agencies need to evolve from an organization that is actually almost built to say no, to an organization that can go inside and that can say, certain things we're perfectly okay with that. Other things we actually think that there might be a problem, and we recommend you a certain amount of remedies to deal with that. Obviously, this is not an easy thing. This means that you authorize someone to come into your data systems, someone who could be questioning this, and I think you should well design this type of organization, but I think it's a crucial one. If you want the public to trust the information and the data that they put at disposal, you need someone who can really go inside and say, we agree with this and we do not agree with this. In general, and this is what I would like to use as a summary, I'm not sure we do need much more regulation. I think we definitely need much more investment in data innovation. And today, the investment in data innovation is, I think, a little bit too slow in Europe because there's a lot of insecurity on what the framework is and if an additional framework should be coming. I think we actually have all the different elements. The elements that I talk about, a data agency that can go inside, actually it is possible. I think the agreement reached 1 month ago at European level actually enables this type of organization. But it's crucial that we stop this fragmentation. I know that we're going again into the direction of having all national agencies that could implement it in their own ways. This is also how we solved the difficult compromise on net neutrality. We have general principles, and then we say, national authorities should be able to play a bit with it and adapt it to their own taste. I think this is a recipe for a lot of trouble. I think we should try to have as much as possible a European data agency that can intervene, but at least has some case law power in the way it judges on cases. And I do not agree that the idea of how we deal with data is so much different between European countries, because that's a little bit the underlying thing, is saying, the way we think about it in Belgium is definitely different than how people in Poland look at it and how people in Spain look at it. I'm not so sure. I mean, if the discussion is about consumer rights, if the discussion is about non-discrimination, if the discussion is about respect for private life, I think these are universal law values, and these should be equal at the European level. This type of approach, where you will go inside and you judge one direction in one case, another direction in another case, also opens room for experimentation. And I think we need room for experimentation. I'm sure you have talked about entrepreneurship, and you have talked about the fact that we need more entrepreneurs in Europe, and being an entrepreneur means that you take risks and that you make some mistakes from time to time. I think this also applies to governments. Now, you will say governments already make a lot of mistakes. That is maybe true. But in a field that is moving so fast, you need to have a little bit room in the rules to say, let's be open, let's give a little bit more freedom, let's see what will happen, and if we see that things go wrong, we can intervene. But very often in Europe, my feeling is that the way our legislation is organized is in a very, very direct way. Certain things are allowed, and all the rest is not allowed. I think we should view it the other way around. I think we should be clear on certain things that are not allowed, and all the others, please, let's try. I believe that if you give people more freedom in general, they do good things. Now, some bad things might happen, but we shouldn't always have our legislation built on the idea that certain things could go wrong. I think it should be a little bit more about the middle of the road and the idea that if you give freedom, in general, we do good things. I think if we give data, in general, we do good things. Thanks a lot. I will take a few questions, and if I don't have an answer, I will just pass them through to the panel.
Hello. Oh, it works. Hi, my name's Stephen Pearson. I'm from FTI Consulting. I have a question to the Minister, but also the panel. I used to work in better regulation in the UK. And the mantra back in about 2007 was, I can't remember, it was sort of less regulation, better regulation, softer regulation. And then we had a massive economic crash. The banks all failed, and the taxpayer ended up sort of having to bail everyone out. And I'm sort of, alarm bells ringing, I'm hearing the same argument, the same discussions that we were having back in 2007. And I'm sure there will be lessons learned, but I was wondering what safeguards would be put in place to prevent that sort of thing from repeating and happening again.
Well, obviously you've understood that I'm a liberal, and so I believe that if you give people freedom, that in general people do good things. Now, that doesn't mean that there shouldn't be any regulation at all, and that doesn't mean that you should not protect the system from crashing completely. I still, and I would just pull it back in the direction of data. I mean, how many big cases do we have where data was really being abused, where it's really been used in a wrong way? I don't know that many cases. And I was actually very afraid about all the data is on my cell phone, but now I understood that even the NSA cannot get into an iPhone. I mean, I found that actually quite surprising. I thought that all of this was up for grabs, and I understood that it's actually not so. It's not so easy. So I think here we're typically in a case where often we speak about a potential benefit, but in Europe I have the feeling that we related to data and to privacy and data protection almost do not dare to even try, because we're so afraid of what might go in the wrong direction. Now, what happened in the financial industry is a bit of a different perspective, because it's such a systemic element. If the banking system fails, it has such a big impact on the rest of the economy. I'm not sure for data it's on the same, it's at the same level. But maybe I will let any of you add to that. Nothing to add. All right.
Just to open, maybe a reflection, but I throw it, to you and to the public. But we really discuss a lot personal data, and we tend to go back all the times, to personal data, because this is a bit of our European, little perspective angle. But in reality, a lot of data we're talking about, when we talk about data innovation, it's non-personal data. So it's data, take it from agriculture, from manufacturing, which is a big amount of this new data economy. So we really should have a reflection on that type of data as well, and what rules they may or may not need.
Spoke a lot about this being afraid of data, and in the US a lot of companies are just keep innovating, and we are afraid. We try not to use them. Some time passes, and we end up being consumer of those American services at the end. And so that's what happens. So if we don't change our mind, the innovation will happen somewhere else, and that's what we need to rethink, I believe.
Yeah, if I could just comment on what you said, I found interesting about one of the problems surrounding data is the lack of transparency and understanding the potential benefits of it. And I actually think that's really interesting to say, because we talk a lot about data privacy and how to protect it, but we should also just be focusing on the transparency. People just maybe need to know how it's being used. That doesn't mean it should not be being used. And for developers, that's really important, because they do need the data to build their products and make them better, and they're not trying to steal data or use it in a bad way or misuse it. Well, mostly they're not. So I really liked what you said about transparency. I thought it was interesting.
I think this is actually maybe someone in the room has more detail on it. I thought this is what the system is in New Zealand, being just developed on openness of data, on government data, where I think a very, very modern way of using government data, but gigantic fines if you actually use it the wrong way. And I think that's the right combination. I mean, we should be quite open on using it, but being very clear that if you can prove that it's being used against any of the consumer protection laws, that you're actually quite strict on what the consequences are.
Well, thank you.
All right. Well, thank you.
As I began my remarks this morning, I noted the importance of having digital champions in government, and it's clear, Deputy Prime Minister, you're a fantastic champion for technology, and your deep understanding of, I think, the importance of this is just very much appreciated and I think necessary. So thank you very much for your time here today and for sharing your thoughts on this. I want to open the discussion back up to the panel. I want to build off of a few of the points that were made here. In particular, this issue of data localization has come up, and when we talk about kind of some of the immediate policies that those in the kind of data policy space should be talking about, DSM obviously has to be at the top of that list because it's going to have an impact on the openness of data, the flexibility with which companies can trade and engage in this. And so I'll just put this out to the panel. Everyone obviously kind of supports this idea of DSM. What is important that we get right in these policies going forward as it relates to data policy? Katrina.
Specifically with regards to data localization?
Or just in DSM in general, as we're working through this policy,
yeah.
What do we need to be thinking about as it relates to data?
Well, so I think the main thing is obviously we don't want to make it harder. We want to make it easier. So anything that will help that and that will facilitate innovation and allow people to develop great products, those are things that we need to be focusing on. So I think we've mentioned a few times, and also in the previous panel, that there's still a lot of fragmentation. There's too much fragmentation within the EU member states. Then it's very, very difficult to scale within the EU. And I think that that's a main thing. And then also what the Deputy Prime Minister mentioned about data localization and the fact that why do we still have these borders? Why do we still see these? And I think that today is a particularly important day as well with regard to how we view the transfer of data transatlantically with the new Text for Privacy Shield that came out. And I think these are issues that we do need to rethink and think, well, perhaps we can't have the same old solutions that we had to a world that wasn't digital now in a digital world.
So the way of thinking, and an example of Estonia once again. While it's not really easy and does not make sense to be a citizen of every European country at the same time, to be an electronic citizen of every European country is a pretty interesting thought. And Estonia pushed forward with this electronic residency and X-Road system where everyone can actually apply, get registered, certified, and become an electronic citizen of Estonia and do all the business, access to all the data over the internet. And it takes like 5 minutes to open a company and start doing business in Estonia. It takes much more time in Germany. And I think this way of thinking, the entrepreneurs need more flexibility. They want to be left alone to play, to experiment. And I think the policy should also, the way of thinking, be in this direction to allow this, to allow them more flexibility and more space for experimenting.
Yeah, I don't have precise remarks to that, but with regards to what my colleague said and also the minister said, is that I truly believe that we have to have also a presumption of innocence with regards to the use of data that we do not have currently. And I often see in the European Parliament people discussing about it and all the time putting in front the worries and the problems instead of thinking about common solutions. It is clear that it's not easy to find a solution, but where I think we should do a lot more work is to improve the way we educate people about the good use of data, how a person could protect its own data, and how an employee of a company can use fairly and legally the data that it gets from you. And here we are facing a lot of problems across Europe because sometimes a lot of the mistakes that are being done by private companies, but also by people within the public administrations, come from the lack of information, of skills, of education with regards to data protection and data use. And we have to do a lot of work towards that.
We don't have a perfect formula yet because we are reflecting as European Commission, as you know, on the results still of a public consultation we closed in December. So we hope by the end of this coming month we will have a consolidated report on that. But in addition to what you mentioned of the data localization restrictions, which is of course an important thread, I can tell you what we are looking at in particular, and then we are looking at seeing if there's any issue related to ownership. And for once, this topic of the ownership of data was not something that the Commission came up with. So you were mentioning in the first panel, this regulatory urge that we have sometimes. This was not the case with industry coming to us and telling us to do something about data ownership. Because exactly we have a regime for data protection for personal data, but we don't have any regime in place for industrial data. And so if we don't have any certainty, especially SMEs, about who owns the data, SMEs will not invest. So it was something which we got from some sectors of industry. We're looking at two other concepts, or three: liability, of course, so the new types of liability deriving in the Internet of Things from data and data use. The so-called super PSI concept, so a bit like the French legislation which is now, applying the concept that some categories of public utilities data could be shared with public administrations and with governments because they have a public utility purpose, even if they are in private hands and on which conditions. And finally, these emerging data brokerage markets, which are still a very nascent reality in Europe. They're less developed than in the US. But looking at data as an economic asset and as an economic good and seeing how the data markets will develop.
Yeah, let me bring you in, Philippe. And I want to broaden the question a little bit more. And to get to this other point that was brought up, one of the reasons, as I said, that we created the Center for Data Innovation is specifically to change this conversation so that we have an opportunity to really focus on these solutions. And obviously that's what we're doing on this panel. But part of the problem here, I think, is there's a lack of urgency around the need for data-driven innovation. So I think, as I said, I think we've gone a long way in the past 3 years. Now we have people recognizing the benefits, but they're not recognizing the urgency of the benefits. So we don't have, people demanding, saying, look, we have tens of thousands of people dying every year from diseases that we might be able to address if we had more medical research. We don't say that there are so many lives lost every year to accidents on the road where better data could help address these issues. And there's so many cases like that. And there's still, I think, this lack of collective urgency for saying it's not just that we have to get this right. We have to get this right now. We need to do something immediately to really get these benefits. And so, in the context of DSM, but also in this kind of broader context, I'd like to invite you on how do we address that side of the problem? Okay.
Yeah, very good point you mentioned, Darren, and it's actually going into the direction I wanted to mention. So and I'd like to make the point that at this stage, maybe the EU institutions and their representatives could also make, prove to businesses and to startups that they're actually able to deliver in rather short, let's say, business terms of time, right? So we're now in May looking at 1 year into the DSM communication, and the impression that raises a little bit is that we're all talking about a digital single market, so it must be somewhere here, right? But I think in reality we're further away than we think. And maybe an advice towards policymakers here could be that we could look into low-hanging fruits or things that are easier to reach, also to show to the business economy, to the business world that we really appreciate innovative, data-driven business in Europe, and we try to make it easier for them to do business here in Europe. And maybe not getting lost in too much of abstract and detailed debates about platforms and other things where many business people don't really see the point what it actually is about, but maybe look at some other things. So as one example, startups and scaling startups have a huge need for talent. So they have raised and grown a successful company in Europe, and now they're looking into how to get all the developers and managers that know about data and data innovation, and maybe it could be a good advice to make it as easy as possible for those companies to hire in Europe instead of going somewhere else where this talent is.
Yeah, if I could just go back, I agree with what Leonard said, but just back to the perceived sense of lack of urgency. I don't think that policymakers do sense a lack of urgency. I think that the real reason is a couple of things. So perhaps the length of the lawmaking process in the EU is extremely long. So there's just no way that a law could get passed as quickly as it would need to in the digital sphere. And then I think as well that a lot of policymakers, they do want to make the right changes and they do want to make an impact, but they also need to understand what they're working with. Not all MEPs have a digital background or tech background, so there's that as well that they do need to understand. And I think that this is a really good example of where industry standards can come in as well. So if we can work more with industry-based standards, see what works best there, instead of working on legislation that would come out in say 2 years' time, that maybe at that time wouldn't even be relevant again. I agree that we shouldn't try and reach too far either and try and tackle issues that are right now still hypothetical.
Yeah, well, my main comment about your question, which was how to address data literacy and how to make it better, which I thought was quite key, is by just doing it. If we can find a way where we can have bigger organizations sharing a part of their data set and have some academic people working on it, some startup working on it, all working together over a weekend or over a month, then both the bigger organization will understand what can be done with the data, and academic or smaller organization can understand what that big data is all about. Yeah. For example, we are currently running a hackathon with Procter & Gamble, where we get one full year of data from one plant in the UK. That's over 800 terabytes of data. And we have like 70 data-centric people looking at it and trying to understand what can be done. And the central theme for that is sustainability. So they cannot, as long as we produce with less means, then it will be a success. So just do it. That would be my advice. Don't try to formalize it too much. Just bring people together and do it. And that's what I like about it. Yeah.
Let me ask you to comment as well on, a little bit more about your perspective of where the data science community is in Europe, especially as it, might relate to other regions of the world. You're obviously, very involved in this, and when we've looked at in the United States specifically, communities that are doing very well, they have, tremendous data science talent. And it's not only coming from it's universities, it is businesses, but it's also basically every night of the week you can see data science events where people are just coming together because they are so excited about this. It's their day job, but it's their nightlife as well. How do you see this developing right now? In the data science hub that you're running.
We are quite lucky in Belgium because Belgium is known as a country where maths and statistics and things like that are well taught to the students. So we have a very broad base of people who can understand that topic. And just for your information, just in Brussels alone, we have 1,600 people who are within the data science community, and that's 1/3 in the academic world, 1/3 in big corporations, and 1/3 really hands-on data science nerds. So I don't think that from what I hear, and I've been in it for a while now, we don't have a lack of data science people. We have a lack of managers within bigger organizations who understand what they can do with data.
And I also ask this be for anyone, are there gender divides or any other demographic divides in the data science community that you're trying to address and that people have ideas about how we could address?
Well, we were quite lucky. We are doing a data innovation summit, and thank you very much. It was a nice, where on the 23rd of March, where everybody is invited, of course. And the way we address it is, we have like 40 speakers, and we only will have women talking about data science, just to make it more interesting and to show that it's not only men who talk about mathematical things, but there is a lot of women who knows about it. And when you look at demographics, out of the 1,600 members that we have, when you look at in general, it's only only 13% of our women. But when you look at the youngsters, like below 25, like it's 50-50. So we are doing well. The young graduates are more into data science, and there is a perfect balance between women and men there.
With the ESA, what we're trying to do with the education data academy, European Data Academy, we are trying to look basically at new profiles. I mean, what is missing is not specialized skills, in the classic profiles. What is missing is more like having people who can take the data analytics from a more holistic perspective. And so do the data processing, but also have some knowledge of, the data economy, of the marketing aspects, or combine different disciplines. And this is what we see is missing the most. So you can find very skilled people in Europe, but they tend to be monochromatic, let's say. Well, since that most of innovation is coming up from profiles who can combine different disciplines, also some humanistic with computer science at times. And this is a bit the frontier and the new challenge that we see.
Yeah, if I can talk about the app developer environment. The Application Developers Alliance actually part of our work. So obviously I'm on the policy team, but another section of our work is research. So we perform our own research, we do our own studies. And one of our recent studies, the Insight Developer Report, showed that there are more women that are becoming involved in coding. And I think another recent report showed that women tend to write better code. I mean, I guess it's debatable, but I did read that somewhere. And we'd actually take part in a lot of initiatives that are getting more girls into coding and to try and promote that as well.
Victor, I want to bring you into the conversation as well on this, particularly around the question of youth and high unemployment among youth. On the one hand, we hear about data science as a big opportunity. On the other hand, we see high unemployment among that demographic, which is kind of the ideal demographic for being involved in this because they should have kind of the latest skill set. How do we kind of bridge this disconnect? Is there a disconnect there? Are there other, more pervasive issues that affect this?
Yeah, I really believe that knowledge in the ICT can enable people to find jobs. The problems that we are facing today is that we don't have a common policy across Europe with regards to ICT education. It's not a competence of the level of the EU, and unfortunately, because of this fact, in my opinion, we stopped discussing about it. So we have isolated projects. Some are financed by the European Commission, but there isn't a clear strategy towards this. And we have a big gap among different member states. So what I believe we can do is to actually try to introduce ICT skills from an early age in schools, because today every type of skill with relation to technology is useful in any profession. So we are not talking about people that are going to write codes for all their lives. We are talking about people that need ICT skills, need to know how to use data in any type of activity, from a salesperson to a person even driving a bus if he's going to use the new technologies that are going to be implemented. Everyone needs to have a minimum level of skills, and we have to start now. Unfortunately, again, I don't want to be the bad guy, but I liked it when I started today. We are discussing too much about it and not doing enough. These worries that I have is not in relation to what all of you are doing. This is like I'm shouting out loud because it's what I need to do as a politician, saying that we need to do it now. We started discussing about data 3 years ago, like you mentioned, but in the last few years, I think we didn't do enough. Real life is different from the life of politicians or policymakers. This is what I want to stress out. We cannot wait. Every day that we are losing a lot more than we can actually imagine.
That's an important point. And I want to bring this back to kind of the personal level. When we usually say personal level in data, you're thinking privacy, but there's really this question of thinking about data as something that's essential for individuals. We've written about how data is the oxygen, that it's essential to being able to thrive in a community, and that we should be thinking about data collection as a right for the individual, that in fact when people don't have data collected about them, that actually can put them at a disadvantage. And we also want people to really be demanding data services. I mean, we certainly see once we provide a service that people don't want it taken away. So it was briefly mentioned the example of food safety inspection, which has gotten very popular in the United States, where the information, you always had the food safety inspectors, but now this information is much more available to the consumers. So when you go out to a restaurant, you immediately know what's a healthy restaurant to eat at, which has had a good food safety inspection, which aren't. And of course, that creates these feedback cycles that don't just tell the consumer where they should eat, but it actually it reinforces the idea that this is important, and you see changes in food safety within the restaurant industry. And so the question that I have for the panel is really, how do we get citizens to start demanding data-driven services? How do we make this not just just like we had people grow up and they're digital natives? How do we really get data natives, where people say, this is a key part of my identity, this is a key part of how I want to live in this world? And it seems like that has to be part of the demand for these services. It can't just be pushed out by the government, although certainly government can help lead this. Beatrice?
My reply to this, it's one avenue certainly is going local, so go closer to the citizen, and this applies especially to open data. That's what we are trying to do with our open data policy that I didn't mention before. And I was very surprised. I was in Puglia in September, so it's southern Italy region, to see how advanced they are with open data. They have applications, apps for the citizens. They have a very advanced portal. And to me, it was something surprising. I was not aware of this, local reality in the southern Italian region. So we are trying to foster a bit this environment also through our portal, which was launched in November, which is the European Data Portal.eu. Check it out and see what data sets you can find. But that's the point. You need to have apps and things which are relevant and interesting at the local level for citizens, at the town level, at the community level, so that people start buying into it.
Katrina, let me bring you in, because apps are the way a lot of people get local and get that kind of immediate benefit. Maybe you can talk a little bit about what you've seen.
I think that we've talked a lot about the mindset that we have in the EU regarding certain uses of data, or perhaps fear about how our data is being used and collected and processed. And so to me, that's really key. That's something that we need to work on, is the awareness surrounding data, and to let people know how it's being used, why it's being used, and that it's not, app developers aren't out to get them, that they actually just want to make their lives easier and better.
So we can't not talk about data protection regulations. So I want to put that out there just as a topic. I think the main question I have for this panel is, in the paper that we put out there, one of the projects that we highlighted was a medical research project that the EU is sponsoring, which is really helping hospitals and other research organizations bring together data and create the technical platform for sharing data, but also really kind of overcome some of the policy challenges. But of course, you don't have these kind of centralized organizations to help the private sector overcome data sharing challenges that they face with different regulations. So the question to the panel is, how should companies approach the challenges that they'll face in both trying to comply with the regulations that obviously they need to comply with, but also really trying to be very innovative and doing new things with data, and really confronting some of the fundamental underlying tensions between how data-driven innovation occurs, which is taking data that you didn't know how there was value there and creating value with the data protection regulations would say, basically, don't do that. Don't do something novel with this data because that's going against data minimization principles or data collection requirements about consent. How do we kind of square those two circles? Yeah. Go ahead.
Well, I made a brief comment about that beforehand, but maybe we've been speaking on a different panel actually with Kaya Kallis, and she asked the question whether the GDPR can provide a competitive advantage to Europe, and I think whereas data protection in itself might be a competitive advantage, the GDPR probably is not, and this is exactly what you mentioned, because there's a couple of provisions that really are not really incentivizing innovation and so on. But I think now that we have this text and we want to be positive and optimistic, forward-looking, I think the advice that we are trying to give is really go out and look and search the dialogue with your local and regional regulators. They are making the rules and they are a bit on the trigger when it comes to how fast innovation will be possible and can be brought on the market. And the better they understand data innovation, the faster and the more agile companies can react in this environment.
Yeah, to add to that, obviously I think we're all happy that GDPR has been reached, but now we're looking at how it's going to be implemented, and there's still very many question marks. And I think if there are question marks from a policy perspective, there's certainly many more from a tech perspective. So if you're an app developer and you just want to comply with this legislation, you're going to have to know what exactly you need to do to comply. So there needs to be some sort of guidelines that they can follow. And so something that we did in the US with one of our member companies, Intuit, was to develop open source code for short privacy notices. So if we could get it to that stage where it's so clear what developers and entrepreneurs need to do to use this piece of legislation and to comply, I think that would be really great.
Anonymization guidelines is definitely, something which is on the horizon or on the table. I don't want to say that it's, there is already a proposal, but it's something that we're discussing. And there is money we are giving again under Age 2020 for privacy preserving technology specifically, because we think also from privacy should not only be, seen as a legal conundrum, but we could find, a technology response to some of these issues or some of these conundrums. And then something which I really find stimulating is the idea of personal data spaces, or some call them PIMS, personal information management systems. It is, again, a nascent community in Europe, but we had, a workshop in November, and I was astonished to see how many firms and companies are working around this concept. And this would give consumers the possibility to decide and to give consent, to certain applications in an easier way on different devices. So I think it's something we should look into, as a perspective.
Also, I mentioned this topic when I first intervened, and I think we have to be more proactive. So simply putting on a website a guideline is not enough, because what I'm always thinking about is a small entrepreneur having 3 employees in the other part of Europe. I don't know, in Poland, in Portugal. When is that is open or has a business willing to go in other European states? That person will never look for that guideline. How are we capable of delivering this information to that person to make the European market accessible to that company? This is what we need to do. And in my opinion is that beside writing the guideline, which is a great first step, is actually push maybe, I don't know, the representation of the European Commission in different member states to be proactive and actually do information campaigns, active information campaigns with business owners about what are the rules, how they can comply with it, how they can use it, how they can, because the biggest problem with regulation at the European level is not the regulation itself. It's the lack of information about it, and the fact that only the big players that have a lot of lawyers, a lot of money, can use it, and the smaller ones do not know how to use it because they do not have the information needed to apply it.
Well, I want to bring up the point that Deputy Prime Minister De Croo brought up about this really kind of fundamental question of the role of the data protection authorities and how they're kind of seen as the group that says no. No, you can't do this. No, you can't do that. And can they be re-envisioned as an agency that really helps get to that yes, that makes it so it's not that the small business has to go online and read the regulation, but maybe they just call up their local data protection official and say, this is what we're doing. Tell us what we need to do so we can go global. And it them providing assistance. That's still protecting obviously what's doing their role, but moving it away from this kind of police cop mentality to one that they're actually providing assistance where there's demand for their service from businesses. Is that something that could happen, and how would that how could that happen?
So I'm going to follow through just shortly. So I completely agree with you. I read the document that you send us and the proposal that you make. It can be a solution. It can be a great solution. I don't know if the French companies are calling their data specialists right now in France, but because they already introduced this proposal. But I completely agree. We have to have someone or an institution being capable to provide the information as a consultancy for companies and business owners. And this can be a great solution, the one that you have proposed.
We have a few minutes left. I want to make sure we open it up. And we're, of course, going to have plenty of time to talk over drinks as well. But I'd like to see if there's any questions right now for the panel. We still have mics? Yes, right here. Yes, we do have a microphone coming up. Right here, fourth row.
Thank you, Niklas Anzinger from Dahlia Research, a technology startup in Berlin. My question is to Leonard, but maybe also to others. What kind of ecosystem needs to be in place to attract innovative companies, attract entrepreneurship on a city level? Because we talked a lot about European regulation, national regulation. What I see and hear is that especially cities are very interested in attracting young startups, entrepreneurs, makes the city much more attractive. So what could cities do to attract companies to come to the cities?
Very interesting. So I guess a great question. I think what startups are looking for is mainly in that regard, business-driven aspects. So they would look for, of course, good connectivity, access to finance and talent, and probably a good crowd already there. So a network of mentors and people they can borrow ideas from, and they can do a bit of sparring. I think what we see throughout Europe is also that according to the different legal landscapes and regulatory landscapes, different hubs develop, right? So we see a bit more fintech in London, for example, and so on. So I think that is an aspect. But then if we look at Europe in a broader context, I think it's really important that Europe as a whole becomes more attractive to entrepreneurs, so to people also from outside Europe that want to create a company, that want to found a company, and that they don't have to make the decision whether to go to Luxembourg, Belgium, or the Netherlands to found their company, but they can simply go to Europe and benefit from the best that is available on at least in the whole Schengen area.
Are there other questions? Right here.
Okay, I'm happy to see entrepreneur. So I have a question for you, entrepreneur. 10 years ago, I wanted to do data mining, and everyone told me you have to go to Silicon Valley. So I said, not really, but many friends did go there, and many stayed, because yes, indeed, they were able to try, and sometimes to fail. Nowadays, we see in Europe, there is something in it, so we try to do that. What would be your advice, except go to the Silicon Valley, for young entrepreneurs with regard to data innovation? So not only try, but what specific advice when speaking about data?
Silicon Valley. What is special about Silicon Valley is on one side, the ecosystem of companies who are really willing to discuss things. So they meet regularly, discuss things, and new ideas are born. But at the same time, they have both think tanks and accelerators, where you get mentors, you get access to money, you get a lot of services around that. And there are more and more in Europe. And Berlin and Paris are such accelerators. Coming, and this is, I think, that entrepreneurs should try to leverage the benefits that Europe is now also offering, because it's not the Silicon Valley the only place. In the US, there's, for example, North Carolina, Charlotte has a huge amount of startups as well. It's just not that marketed well. And we need to do more on marketing side for Europe.
Yeah, I will try to relate both questions. So I think a young entrepreneur or a new entrepreneur has to think more about his customers, his clients, what they are asking for, what do they need, and you have to be next to them. If you do your business elsewhere, it's not important, but you have to be next to them to understand them better. What is clear now with regards to data management is that people in Europe, companies in Europe, public administrations in Europe need to know how to use their data. We don't have this knowledge currently in Europe enough. We don't have enough knowledge about it. So the clients are here. So go find them. This is a question. This is my proposal now. And they are here. They aren't in Silicon Valley. They aren't so much in the United States because they already have their partners, relations already established. You have them in Europe. Go find them, and I think you can do a great job about it.
So with that, we're going to conclude our panel. I'd like to, again, thank Leonard Kauschwitz of Allied for Startups, Philippe Van Eep of the Data Science Community and European Data Innovation Hub, Victor Negresco, MEP, Katrina Meehan of the Application Developers Alliance, Beatrice Cavassi with the European Commission, and Demir with Axonom. So please join me in thanking our excellent panel. So again, thanks to everyone for being here today. I just want to say again, I appreciate everyone's participation today. And going forward, we intend to do many more events, more reports, obviously be very engaged in this. So I'd encourage you to do two things. One, everyone in this room clearly knows a lot about this space, and I'd encourage you to feel free to reach out to us if there are particular issues you think we should be working on, if there are particular topics you would like to see discussed in forums. Our goal is to help accelerate this conversation. And so, this isn't something we're going to be doing alone. This is something we're doing with everyone that wants to be a part of this conversation. So please reach out to us and let us know what we can do. And the second, I just say is, next time we do an event, of course, we want to have twice as many people here. So please tell your friends and colleagues about the work that we're doing. Even if you don't like what we're doing and you think you should get them here to tell us why we're wrong, we encourage that as well. We're a think tank. We like to engage in debates about ideas. So please thank you again for being here and join us outside for drinks. Thank you.